Starship Downfall Act 1. The Reckless Escape Chapter 1. Ghost in the Grid. The Trigger. Mason Kane adjusted the frayed collar of his maintenance jumpsuit as he strode confidently down the sterile white corridor of Atlas Command. The too-tight uniform itched at his neck, but the discomfort was a small price to pay. Around him, the polished floors reflected the harsh overhead lights, creating a gleaming path toward his destination. Security drones hummed past at regular intervals, their optical sensors sweeping the hallway. None gave him a second look. The forged credentials pinned to his chest projected the perfect level of mediocrity. Just another anonymous tech, invisible to the higher-ups who ran this place. He flexed his fingers inside the thin maintenance gloves, feeling the stolen keycard hidden in his palm. 6 hours of surveillance, 3 bribed janitors, and 1 unconscious security officer had gotten him this far. Now came the part where everything could fall apart. A pair of officers rounded the corner ahead, deep in conversation about duty rotations. Mason kept his eyes down and stepped slightly aside, giving a respectful nod as they passed. "Power grid's been glitching on level 6 again," one muttered to the other. "Command keeps cutting corners on infrastructure," her companion replied, their voices fading as they continued down the corridor. Mason allowed himself a thin smile. The glitches were his doing, minor disruptions he'd introduced into the system over the past 3 days. Each one insignificant enough to be dismissed as routine maintenance issues, but together they'd created the perfect diversion. At the junction ahead, he casually checked a small tablet displaying system schematics. The secondary power conduit access panel was 15 meters ahead on the right, exactly where his intel had placed it. Mason tapped the tablet twice and slipped it back into his pocket as he approached. The corridor stretched empty before him. He had perhaps 40 seconds before the next security sweep. Mason knelt before the access panel, making a show of examining it while his fingers found the concealed seam. With practiced precision, he slid the panel open, revealing a complex array of power couplings and system monitors. The heart of Atlas Command's redundant power grid, and his target. "Performing scheduled maintenance check on junction H12, he said aloud, knowing the corridor's passive audio monitors would record his voice. He'd timed his approach to coincide with the actual scheduled maintenance in a different sector. If anyone cross-referenced the logs later, they'd find an approved work order. Mason slid the stolen keycard from his palm, examining its smooth surface. The officer who'd donated it wouldn't discover it missing for hours yet. He took a deep breath, steadying his hand. Once he swiped this card, there was no going back. "First rule of operations," he muttered to himself. "Commit or quit." He swiped the card through the reader. The system chimed softly as green authentication lights flickered across the panel. Mason's fingers danced across the controls, bypassing 3 security protocols in rapid succession. His movements were practiced, efficient, the result of weeks spent memorizing the classified schematics he'd stolen from a drunk engineer in a spaceport bar. A tiny screen embedded in the panel requested his authorization code. Mason entered the 16-digit sequence he'd extracted from the command's database. The system processed for an agonizing 3 seconds before accepting it with a satisfied beep. "Initiating diagnostic sequence," he announced for the benefit of the audio monitors, while his fingers executed a completely different command set. Behind the panel, the power routing matrix reconfigured itself according to his instructions. Nothing visible happened. No alarms, no flashing lights, but Mason knew what he'd just set in motion. In exactly 27 minutes, the primary power grid would detect a catastrophic surge in the backup systems. The automated failsafes would trigger, initiating a controlled shutdown of non-essential systems across the facility, including the security lockdown on Hangar Bay 7, where the Stardust Drifter waited, fueled, and prepped for launch. Mason carefully closed the panel, making sure to leave it exactly as he'd found it. He stood, brushing imaginary dust from his knees, and began walking unhurriedly back the way he'd come. The countdown had begun. "Maintenance complete on junction H12, he said clearly. "No issues detected." The lie fell easily from his lips as he rounded the corner, already calculating his route to the hangar. 26 minutes remained. He needed to be in position when the lights went out. A security drone hovered at the intersection ahead, its sensors sweeping methodically across the corridor. Mason kept his pace steady, his expression neutral. Just another tech finishing another boring shift. Nothing to see. The drone passed him without incident, continuing its patrol. Mason allowed himself a small exhalation. The first piece was in place. Now he just needed to survive the next 25 minutes without raising any alarms. The countdown ticked silently in his head as he moved through the heart of Atlas Command, a ghost who'd just set the stage for his greatest disappearing act. The Cascade Mace stepped into the empty maintenance hub connecting the east and west wings of the facility. The circular room housed a ring of terminal stations, monitoring posts for Atlas Command's vast power infrastructure. At this hour, the hub stood deserted, just as his intel had promised. The main engineering crew was responding to a fabricated coolant leak 3 levels below, another piece of his carefully orchestrated distraction. He moved quickly to the first unoccupied terminal, sliding into the swivel chair and keying in the access codes he'd memorized. The screen flickered to life, bathing his face in blue light. "Time to make things interesting," Mason muttered as his fingers flew across the interface. He navigated through security protocols with practiced efficiency, locating the sector grid controls buried beneath layers of system architecture. The terminal pinged softly as it accepted his commands. Mason pulled a small data spike from his boot heel and inserted it into the workstation's port. The device pulsed once with red light as it deployed its payload, a self-replicating virus designed to temporarily overwhelm the system's security measures without leaving permanent damage. Mason glanced at the hub's entrance. Still clear. 18 minutes until his primary cascade triggered, but he needed secondary points of failure to ensure the power drop hit exactly when and where he needed it. He moved to the second terminal, crossing the hub in 4 quick strides. This station controlled redundant power relays for the eastern sectors, including Hangar Bay 7. Mason logged in with a different set of credentials, stolen from a systems tech whose uniform now sat at the bottom of a laundry chute. Come on," he whispered as the authentication process crawled. A drop of sweat traced a path down his temple. Every second he spent here increased his risk of discovery. The terminal finally granted access with a satisfied chime. Mason didn't waste time, immediately bypassing the safety interlocks on the power distribution grid. He programmed a subtle flaw into the load balancing algorithm, nothing that would trigger immediate alerts, but enough to create unstable power fluctuations when combined with his other sabotage. Around him, the lights flickered almost imperceptibly. The hub's ambient hum deepened, the sound of power systems straining against unexpected demands. Mason allowed himself a tight smile. It was working. "Last piece," he murmured, moving to a third terminal positioned on the far side of the hub. This one required physical key authentication, a problem he'd solved by cloning the security officer's keycard during their brief encounter in the utility closet. Mason swiped the card and entered the final sequence. This terminal controlled the emergency power diversion systems, the protocols that would activate when the primary cascade began. With careful precision, he rewrote the emergency response parameters, creating a feedback loop between the first 2 sabotaged systems. When the power surge hit, instead of rerouting cleanly to backup systems, it would cycle back through the compromised grid, multiplying in strength until the automated safety protocols had no choice but to initiate a controlled shutdown across the entire sector. The overhead lights buzzed louder, dimming noticeably as the hub's equipment began responding to the invisible corruption spreading through the power systems. A low, throbbing hum built in the walls around him, power conduits straining against unusual load patterns. Mason logged out of the final terminal, carefully erasing evidence of his presence from the system logs. He stood, glancing at his tablet. 14 minutes remaining until the primary cascade triggered. The secondary systems were already showing strain, displays throughout the hub flickering with warning indicators. A warning klaxon sounded in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Someone had noticed something wasn't right. Mason's pulse quickened. They'd deployed response teams sooner than he'd anticipated. He moved toward the exit, keeping his pace measured and confident. The maintenance jumpsuit would still provide cover for now. If stopped, he was just another tech responding to the growing power issues. As he reached the doorway, the hub's lights dimmed again, longer this time, before struggling back to full brightness. The hum in the walls had deepened to a growl. Electrical systems popped and crackled beneath ceiling panels. "Warning, power fluctuations detected in East Sector grid," announced a synthetic voice over the facility's comm system. "Technical teams, please initiate Diagnostic Protocol 7 Alpha." Mason stepped through the doorway into the corridor beyond, joining the growing number of personnel moving with purpose through the halls. Perfect camouflage. He checked his tablet one last time. 13 minutes until the primary cascade triggered, but his secondary sabotage was already accelerating the timeline. The lights buzzed and flickered overhead as he walked, the growing instability of the power grid becoming impossible to ignore. Soon, Atlas Command would experience darkness for the first time in decades. And in that darkness, Mason Kane would disappear. The warning. In the dim glow of Security Command, Lieutenant Farron rubbed his tired eyes as he monitored the bank of displays before him. 4 hours into a 12-hour shift, the monotony of observation had dulled his senses. The coffee beside him had long gone cold, forgotten during a routine system check. Then his console erupted in crimson. "What the hell?" Farron straightened, fingers flying across the interface as warning indicators multiplied across his screen. What had started as minor fluctuations in the East Sector grid had suddenly spiked into dangerous territory. The power draw metrics surged beyond safety parameters, threatening to overwhelm the stabilizers. "This isn't a fluctuation," he muttered, pulling up the diagnostic overlay. "It's a A.D.A.M overload." The readings didn't make sense. Power systems were triply redundant, with automated failsafes designed to prevent exactly this kind of cascade. He cross-referenced the data against standard protocols, confirming his suspicions. Something was systematically corrupting the grid's self-regulation. Farron slammed his palm against the alert trigger. Immediately, emergency lights began pulsing overhead as the facility's announcement system activated. "Attention all personnel. Code 3 power failure detected in East Sector. This is not a drill. All essential personnel report to emergency stations. Technical teams implement Containment Protocol 596. Around him, the Security Command Center transformed from quiet vigilance to controlled chaos. Duty officers abandoned break rooms and monitoring stations, rushing to assigned emergency posts. Screens throughout the center shifted to crisis mode, displaying evacuation routes and containment procedures. Mason was crossing the central atrium when the Code 3 announcement echoed through the vast space. The crowd around him shifted instantly, some personnel hurrying toward duty stations, while others cleared pathways for emergency responders. The perfect distraction. He checked his tablet. 11 minutes until his primary cascade triggered, but the secondary sabotage was accelerating everything. The lights above flickered more frequently now, staying dark longer with each pulse. The massive holographic displays suspended throughout the atrium glitched, digital artifacts distorting the Terran Strategic Command insignia. "All non-essential personnel, please proceed to designated safety areas," the synthetic voice announced, eerily calm amid growing chaos. Mason adjusted his course, angling toward a service corridor that would take him closer to Hangar Bay 7. Emergency protocols would be activating throughout the facility, including the automated security overrides that would temporarily unlock the restricted hangars for evacuation purposes. Perfect. He merged with a group of maintenance techs hurrying toward the East Wing, adopting their urgent pace and concerned expressions. Around them, wall panels sparked as power surged unpredictably through conduits never designed to handle such loads. "Never seen fluctuations like this," one tech muttered as they rushed forward. "Systems tearing itself apart." "Reminds me of the Orion station collapse," another replied. "Started just like this, small glitches, then complete cascade failure." Mason kept his head down, letting their conversation flow around him. 8 minutes remained according to his calculations, but the acceleration was unmistakable. The facility's automated systems were fighting a losing battle against his sabotage. A security checkpoint loomed ahead. 2 officers directing traffic, checking credentials as personnel streamed past. Mason tensed. This hadn't been in his intelligence briefing. The checkpoint stood directly between him and his route to the hangar. As he approached, the overhead lights dimmed completely for 3 seconds before sputtering back to half brightness. In that moment of darkness, emergency batteries kicked in, bathing the corridor in red auxiliary lighting. The security officers looked up, distracted by the worsening power situation. Their handhelds beeped with incoming alerts, pulling their attention away from credential checks. All security personnel report status, crackled their comms. East wing stabilizers failing. Potential full blackout imminent. Mason slipped past during the confusion, just another tech responding to the crisis. Behind him, he heard one officer cursing as his security console went dark completely. The service corridor beyond was nearly empty, most personnel having already evacuated or reported to emergency stations. Mason quickened his pace, no longer needing to maintain his careful facade. The lights continued their erratic pattern, flashes of darkness growing longer, the power grid losing its struggle against the cascading failures. His tablet vibrated with an updated alert. The primary cascade had triggered, 7 minutes ahead of schedule. The chain reaction was propagating faster than even he had anticipated. Somewhere in the distance, a secondary explosion rumbled through the structure. Mason felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. Emergency klaxons wailed with renewed urgency. Atlas Command was going dark, exactly as planned, but Mason needed to move faster. The window for his escape was narrowing by the second. The path to Hangar Bay 7 lay just ahead, and with it, freedom. The point of no return. Mason skidded around the corner as the overhead lights stuttered through another death cycle. The corridor ahead stretched toward Hangar Bay 7, now bathed in the blood-red glow of emergency lighting. The steady wail of alarms had become white noise, punctuated by distant shouts and the occasional rumble of overtaxed systems failing throughout the facility. He pressed himself against the wall as a squad of security personnel rushed past an intersecting hallway, their boots pounding in synchronized urgency. None spotted him in the chaotic darkness. Once they'd passed, Mason pushed forward, checking his tablet one final time. The cascade had progressed beyond his expectations. System after system was collapsing, the chain reaction spreading through Atlas Command like a digital wildfire. But with chaos came scrutiny. Someone would eventually trace the failure's origin, if they hadn't already. Time to cover his tracks. Mason slowed as he approached a secondary junction box, embedded in the corridor wall. This particular node connected the hangar security systems to the main grid, and more importantly, to the central log servers. Every authorized and unauthorized access, every system command, every identity verification from the past day was cached here before being permanently archived, including 15 minutes of Mason Kane's carefully choreographed sabotage. He popped the panel with practiced efficiency, revealing a complex mesh of fiber optic cables and processing units. The junction's status lights pulsed orange, emergency protocols active but functioning. Mason reached into his boot and extracted a small, metallic cylinder no larger than his thumb. The hardline virus inside represented months of work, designed for one specific purpose: selective digital amnesia. "Time to disappear," he muttered, locating the primary data port. As he connected the virus cylinder to the junction, rapid footsteps approached from the corridor behind him. Mason didn't look back, his fingers flying over the initialization sequence. 3 seconds to breach the firewalls, 2 seconds to locate the targeted logs, 1 second to, "You there? Step away from that panel." Mason completed the final command as the security officer's voice boomed through the corridor. The virus cylinder pulsed blue once, then red, then green, confirmation of successful deployment. It was already rewriting history, erasing every trace of Mason's actions from the system. He turned slowly, hands raised in apparent submission. 2 security officers stood 10 meters away, weapons drawn and aimed squarely at his chest. Their tactical helmets obscured their faces, but their stances conveyed professional tension. "Identification, now," the lead officer demanded, taking a cautious step forward. Mason adopted a panicked expression. "Tech Specialist Mercer, sir. I'm trying to stabilize the junction before we lose the whole sector." The second officer tapped something on his wrist display. "We've got no Mercer on duty in this sector." "I was redirected from West Wing maintenance," Mason explained, his voice pitched with practiced urgency. Check with command if comms are still up. The lead officer hesitated, weapons still trained on Mason. Hands where I can see them. Turn around slowly. Behind them, the overhead lighting surged brightly, then died completely. In the sudden darkness, only the red emergency strips illuminated the corridor. The officer's helmet lamps activated automatically, cutting bright beams through the gloom. "Damn it," the second officer cursed. "Grid's failing completely." Mason kept his hands visible as the junction box behind him quietly completed its work. The virus would self-destruct once finished, leaving no trace of either its presence or the data it had erased. 15 minutes of Mason Kane's existence wiped clean from Atlas Command's memory. A distant explosion shook the corridor, followed by the unmistakable sound of emergency bulkheads slamming shut throughout the facility. The security officers exchanged glances, momentarily distracted by their comms crackling with urgent chatter. "Full evac order just came through," the second officer reported. "Command's going to emergency protocols." The lead officer gestured with his weapon. "You're coming with us to the security checkpoint for verification." Mason nodded compliantly. "Of course, sir. But the hangar systems need." A massive surge ripped through the remaining power grid. Sparks erupted from the junction box behind Mason, the overload causing circuits to blow throughout the corridor. The officers' helmet systems flickered and reset, momentarily blinding them as their visors compensated. In that instant of darkness and confusion, Mason moved. He lunged forward, ducking beneath the lead officer's aim and driving his shoulder into the man's midsection. The officer grunted in surprise, his shot going wide and striking the ceiling. Mason pivoted, using the officer's momentum to send him crashing into his partner. Both men stumbled, disoriented by the collision and the failing systems around them. Mason didn't waste the opportunity. He sprinted down the corridor toward Hangar Base 7, leaving the shouting officers behind. There was no turning back now. His sabotage was complete, his tracks erased, and Atlas Command was descending into darkness. Ahead, the hangar doors waited, and beyond them, the Stardust Drifter and the stars. Freedom was just moments away. The plunge. As the officer's shouts echoed behind him, Mason spotted a maintenance access hatch in the wall ahead. Without breaking stride, he slammed his palm against the emergency release. The panel hissed open, revealing the cramped service tunnel beyond, a labyrinthine network of conduits and crawl spaces that formed Atlas Command's skeletal system. Mason dove inside just as another power surge rippled through the facility. The main lighting grid failed catastrophically, darkness flooding the corridors like an invisible tide. Emergency systems kicked in immediately, bathing everything in crimson emergency lighting that transformed the sterile white halls into something hellish and alien. He pulled the hatch closed behind him, sealing himself inside the narrow maintenance tunnel. The space was tight, designed for repair drones and the occasional human technician, forcing him to crouch as he moved forward. Exposed conduits and junction boxes lined the walls, many now sparking or smoking as the cascade failure spread through Atlas Command's power infrastructure. "Now I'm a ghost," Mason whispered to himself, feeling a surge of savage satisfaction. In the chaos consuming the facility, he had effectively ceased to exist. His digital footprints erased, his physical presence vanished into the walls themselves. He moved through the station's arteries while the body convulsed around him. The tunnel forked ahead. Mason consulted his mental map, orienting himself relative to Hangar Bay 7. Left would take him through the primary ventilation system, faster but more exposed to security sensors. Right would route him through secondary maintenance shafts, slower but virtually unmonitored. Another distant explosion made the decision for him. The left passage trembled, dust and debris raining from overhead panels. Mason veered right, dropping to his hands and knees as the tunnel narrowed further. The air grew hotter, thick with the acrid smell of burning insulation and ozone. The facility's systems were literally cooking themselves from the inside out, circuit by circuit. Mason's sabotage had been more effective than even he had anticipated. Or perhaps something else was amplifying the cascade. No time to analyze it now. He crawled forward, navigating by memory and the stuttering red emergency lights that penetrated even these hidden spaces. Through gaps in the tunnel walls, Mason glimpsed fragments of the chaos unfolding in the main corridors. personnel rushing to evacuation points, security teams establishing perimeters, automated firefighting systems, deploying against electrical fires. Atlas Command, the unassailable fortress of Terran authority, was coming apart at the seams. The tunnel sloped downward, curving toward the outer ring where the hangars connected to the facility. Mason moved faster now, ignoring the burn in his shoulders and knees. The countdown in his head had accelerated. He estimated less than 5 minutes before facility-wide lockdown protocols activated, sealing every hangar bay regardless of the power situation. A repair drone lay inactive in his path, its optical sensors dark. Mason squeezed past the deactivated machine, noting with satisfaction that even the automated systems were failing. Nothing would be tracking his progress through these tunnels. Ahead, filtered red light spilled through a ventilation grill. Mason approached cautiously, peering through the slats into the space beyond. His pulse quickened. He'd reached the upper observation level of Hangar Bay 7. Below, the cavernous hangar stretched in crimson-tinted twilight. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across the floor, where a single ship waited in magnificent isolation, the Stardust Drifter. The battered freighter wasn't much to look at. Mismatched hull plating, outdated sensor arrays, visible patch jobs on the port thruster assembly. But to Mason, she was beautiful. More importantly, she was flight-ready and programmed with the jump coordinates he needed. The hangar appeared deserted, the deck crews having evacuated with the rest of non-essential personnel. Mason studied the space carefully, searching for security officers or automated defense systems. Nothing moved in the red-tinged shadows. He pressed his palm against the grill, applying steady pressure until the aging fasteners gave way. The panel came loose in his hands, and he set it aside silently. Beyond lay a short drop to a maintenance catwalk that circled the upper level of the hangar. As Mason prepared to slip through the opening, his tablet vibrated against his hip. He checked it quickly, expecting another update on the Cascade failure. Instead, a single alert flashed on the screen. Security override, Hangar Bay 7 lockdown initiated, T-minus 120 seconds. Shit, Mason hissed. Someone had manually triggered the hangar security protocols. His window was closing twice as fast as anticipated. He slid through the opening, dropping silently to the catwalk below. The metal walkway swayed slightly under his weight, but held firm. Mason moved like a shadow along the gantry, keeping low as he circled toward the maintenance ladder that would take him to the hangar floor. The Stardust Drifter waited below, just 50 meters away. 2 minutes to reach her, power up her systems, and break atmosphere before the hangar sealed permanently. Mason Kane, the Ghost of Atlas Command, prepared for his final disappearing act. Chapter 2, Power Bleeds. Commander Valerius strode through the command center, unmoved by the pandemonium around him. Red emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across his angular features as technicians scrambled to restore critical systems. The cacophony of alarms, shouted orders, and damage reports washed over him unheeded. "Sir, the security logs are completely wiped." A frantic analyst thrust a tablet toward him. "We can't track the intruder through any of our systems." Valerius barely glanced at the screen. "Then we don't use the systems." He turned toward the tactical display, one of the few stations still operational thanks to independent power. Officers parted before him as he approached, their faces taut with tension. "Our intruder believes they've become a ghost." Valerius swept his hand across the station schematic. "But ghosts still occupy physical space." He tapped a series of commands into the console. The display shifted, highlighting Hangar Bay 7 and the surrounding sectors in pulsing red. "Security teams Alpha through Delta converge on Sector 17, seal all access points, maintenance tunnels, and ventilation shafts." His voice cut through the chaos with cold precision. "The saboteur is headed for the hangars." Lieutenant Mercer appeared at his elbow, breathless. "What makes you so certain, sir?" "Because that's what I would do." Valerius enlarged the hangar section of the schematic. The blackout wasn't random. It created a specific pattern of systems failures that initially left Hangar Bay 7 operational while disabling surveillance. "Our ghost is making an escape, not just causing havoc." Valerius keyed his comm unit. "This is Commander Valerius. Execute Protocol Kingfisher. I want teams moving from the outer perimeter inward. Sweep every maintenance shaft, every crawl space. our target is moving through the infrastructure. Confirmation codes flooded his comm as team leaders acknowledged. On the tactical display, security markers converged on the sector surrounding the hangars. Sir, Protocol Kingfisher will trap hundreds of evacuating personnel, Mercer protested. And one saboteur. Valerius didn't look up from the display. Better inconvenience than dead if this cascade failure reaches critical systems. He studied the schematic, his eyes narrowing. Manually trigger lockdown procedures for Hangar Bay 7. 2-minute countdown. But sir, we have personnel. Do it. Valerius finally turned to fix Mercer with a glacial stare. Our intruder planned this blackout to create a specific window. Let's close it prematurely. Mercer swallowed hard and executed the command. A new countdown appeared on the display. 120 seconds until Hangar Bay 7 sealed permanently. Valerius activated the station-wide comm. All security personnel, this is Commander Valerius. We have an active infiltrator attempting to reach Hangar Bay 7. Consider the target armed and extremely dangerous. Authorization for lethal force granted. He killed the transmission and turned to the security officers gathered around the tactical display. The maintenance tunnels form a web leading to the hangars. Our ghost thinks they've disappeared into the walls. Let's prove them wrong. Valerius tapped a section of the schematic, highlighting a junction point where several maintenance tunnels converged. Team Alpha, concentrate here. This is the primary artery from the power distribution center to the hangar level. He shifted his focus to another section. Bravo, take the ventilation system access points. Delta, secure all hangar entrances. Charlie, sweep the emergency evacuation routes. Our infiltrator might try to blend with evacuating personnel. The security teams mobilized with practiced efficiency, their markers spreading across the tactical display like a closing net. 90 seconds to lockdown, Mercer announced. Valerius nodded, eyes never leaving the display. Deploy tactical drones to the maintenance tunnels. If our ghost has disabled the security sensors, we'll use our own eyes. Small drone markers appeared on the schematic, spreading through the maintenance network like searching fingers. Sir, Team Bravo reports movement in the secondary maintenance shaft, level 5, section C. Valerius smiled thinly. Converge all available teams. Our ghost just became corporeal. He studied the tactical display, calculating intercept trajectories. The security teams were closing from multiple directions, but the maintenance tunnels offered countless divergence points. Their quarry could still slip through the net. 60 seconds to lockdown, Mercer reported. Not enough time. Valerius made his decision. I'm heading to Hangar Bay 7 personally. Have Team Delta meet me at the main entrance. As Valerius strode from the command center, his comm unit crackled with urgent updates. The hunt was narrowing, the prey being driven toward a single point of escape, and he would be waiting when they emerged. Mason crawled through the cramped service tunnel, his shoulders scraping against corrugated metal walls. The acrid smell of fried circuitry hung in the air, a testament to his handiwork. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, transforming the maintenance shafts into arteries of some wounded mechanical beast. He paused at a junction, pressing his ear against a thin section of wall. Beyond it, boots thundered and voices barked orders. Team Alpha, secure Junction 14. All maintenance access points now. Copy that. Deploying tactical drones to flush out the target. Mason smiled grimly. They knew where he was, or at least where he was supposed to be. He deliberately tripped sensors in the eastern tunnels before doubling back west. The oldest trick in the book, but effective when your pursuers were scrambling in the dark. A sudden vibration against his hip made him freeze. His stolen security badge was receiving transmissions. Mason carefully removed it, adjusting its frequency to intercept the tactical channel. Converging on Maintenance Level 5, Section C. All teams acknowledge. Team Bravo acknowledged. Team Charlie moving to cut off exit routes. Team Delta securing hangar perimeter. Mason's jaw tightened. They were locking down his escape route faster than anticipated. He needed to move. Sliding forward on his elbows, he reached a ventilation grate and peered through. Below, 3 security officers swept the corridor with tactical lights, their movements precise and methodical. 90 seconds to complete lockdown, one officer reported into his comm. Mason suppressed a curse. They'd triggered the hangar lockdown manually, cutting his window from 5 minutes to less than 2. Someone in command was thinking like him, anticipating his moves. He waited until the team passed beneath him, then carefully removed the grate and dropped silently into the corridor behind them. A quick dash brought him to a utility closet, where he stripped off his maintenance coveralls to reveal the security uniform beneath. The badge chatter continued as he moved. Team Alpha, negative contact in the eastern tunnels. Sweep again. The intruder could be hiding in the wall panels. Team Bravo, we've got movement in the climate control shaft, Sector 16. Mason smirked. That would be the remote-controlled maintenance drone he'd reprogrammed. Good little distraction, right on schedule. He stepped into a crowded evacuation corridor, instantly adopting the stern expression and purposeful stride of security personnel. Frightened technicians and office workers parted before him as he moved against the flow of evacuees. Security! Make way! He barked, mimicking the authoritative tone he'd heard countless times during his operations. The badge at his hip vibrated again. Commander Valerius is personally overseeing containment at Hangar Bay 7. All teams converge. Valerius, Mason knew the name. Cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient, exactly the kind of officer who'd see through his tactics. This complicated things. A status display on the wall showed 60 seconds until complete lockdown of Hangar Bay 7. Not enough time to reach it through conventional routes. Mason ducked into a side passage, found an environmental control panel, and pried it open. Beyond lay the climate regulation system, a network of massive ducts that served the entire facility. Unpleasant, but unmonitored. He squeezed into the duct, grimacing as his shoulders barely cleared the opening. The metal creaked beneath his weight as he crawled forward, guided by the facility schematic he'd memorized. Team Alpha has breached the Eastern Maintenance Hub. No target. Team Bravo, the movement in Sector 16 was a drone. Repeat, it was a diversion. All teams, redirect to Hangar Bay 7, 45 seconds to lockdown. Mason increased his pace, ignoring the way the sharp edges of the duct sliced at his uniform. Sweat trickled down his face as he navigated the maze of turns. The ducts grew hotter as he approached the hangar section. The climate system working overtime to compensate for the power fluctuations. A final turn brought him to a grate overlooking Hangar Bay 7. Through it, he could see his target, the Stardust Drifter, a battered freighter sitting untouched amid the chaos. The hangar doors were already beginning their slow closure sequence, but between him and the ship stood a squad of security personnel, weapons drawn, and at their center, a tall figure with commander's insignia surveyed the area with calculating eyes. Valerius. 30 seconds to lockdown, came the announcement over the hangar speakers. Mason studied the scene below, mapping escape routes and calculating odds. The ventilation exit was 20 feet above the hangar floor, too high to drop without injury, and completely exposed to gunfire. 25 seconds. The security channel erupted with new reports. Negative contact in all maintenance sections. Where the hell did he go? Mason's eyes fell on a fire suppression system control panel near his position. It wasn't part of his original plan, but plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy, especially when the enemy was Commander Valerius. Mason pressed himself deeper into the service alcove, flattening his body against cold metal as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. The tiny maintenance nook, barely large enough for stored cleaning equipment, offered minimal concealment. A hinged access panel provided his only shield from discovery. The crimson emergency lighting cast elongated shadows as a security patrol rounded the corner. 3 guards moving in tactical formation, their weapons drawn and ready. Mason controlled his breathing, forcing each inhalation to be slow and silent. The confined space intensified the hammering of his heart. 15 seconds to lockdown, the facility AI announced, its feminine voice incongruously calm amidst the chaos. The patrol leader held up a closed fist, signaling his team to halt directly outside Mason's hiding spot. Check these maintenance alcoves. The commander says our target might use them to bypass security checkpoints. Mason's fingers tightened around the stolen stun baton concealed against his thigh. If discovered, he'd have a fraction of a second to disable the nearest guard before the others could react. The odds weren't good, but he'd survived worse. Sector 17 clear, crackled a voice through their comms. "Moving to reinforce hangar perimeter." The patrol leader nodded. "Copy that. We're completing our sweep of Section C now." The first guard moved past Mason's position, checking an equipment locker further down the corridor. The second followed, scanning ceiling access panels with a tactical light. The third guard, a stocky woman with a sergeant's insignia, paused directly in front of Mason's alcove. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing behind her visor. Mason didn't move, didn't breathe. A single drop of sweat traced a line down his temple, but he refused to acknowledge it. The guard's gloved hand reached toward the access panel. 10 seconds to complete lockdown, the AI announced. The patrol leader called from down the corridor. "Sergeant K, keep moving. We need to reach the hangar before lockdown." Her hand hesitated, hovering inches from the panel. Mason remained motionless, his muscles burning with the effort of perfect stillness. "Something feels off about this section," she said, eyes scanning the panel's edges. "The dust pattern is disturbed." Mason's grip tightened on the stun baton. If she opened the panel, he'd have to take her down instantly, then sprint for the hangar. It would alert the entire security force to his position, but with lockdown imminent, he had no choice. "Sergeant." The leader's voice hardened. "That's an order. Hangar Bay 7 is our priority." Sergeant K frowned, her instincts clearly at war with her orders. Her fingers brushed against the panel's edge. Mason readied himself, calculating the most efficient takedown. One strike to the neck, then. "Multiple breaches detected in Sector 20, announced a new voice over their comms. "All available units respond." The patrol leader swore. "That's just 2 sections over. Command, confirm orders." A burst of static, then. "Team Epsilon, redirect to Sector 20. Possible additional infiltrators." Sergeant K's hand withdrew from the panel. She cast one final suspicious glance at Mason's hiding place before turning away. 5 seconds to lockdown, the AI reminded them. "Move out," ordered the patrol leader. Double time to Sector 20. The security team broke into a run, boots echoing down the corridor as they hurried away from Mason's position. He remained frozen, counting heartbeats until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. "Complete lockdown initiated," announced the AI. Mason pushed the panel open and slid out of the alcove, muscles protesting after the prolonged stillness. He'd missed his window to reach Hangar Bay 7 before lockdown. The main routes would be sealed now. The security presence doubled. But Mason had never relied on main routes. He moved swiftly to a maintenance terminal embedded in the wall, using the stolen security credentials to access the system. The blackout had disabled most functions, but the terminal still displayed a schematic of the immediate area. Hangar Bay 7 lay 2 levels below his position, now sealed by 3 separate blast doors. Mason traced alternate paths with his finger, mapping routes through service shafts and emergency access tunnels. The lockdown protocols were thorough, but Atlas Command had been built in stages over decades. Where different construction phases met, there were always gaps in the security architecture. He found what he was looking for, a maintenance shaft designed to allow access to the environmental systems beneath the hangar floor. It wouldn't be monitored during an emergency lockdown. All security would focus on the entrances. Mason disconnected from the terminal and moved to a seemingly solid wall panel. A careful press in the right location revealed a hidden latch. The panel slid aside, exposing a narrow vertical shaft. As he prepared to descend, his thoughts returned to Sergeant Kai. Her instincts had been right. She'd sensed his presence despite his perfect stillness. A good reminder that even the best plans could unravel on the slightest thread of intuition. Next time, he might not be so lucky. Mason braced himself against the wall of the maintenance shaft, the tight space amplifying the sound of his breathing. The direct route to Hangar Bay 7 was completely sealed. Even the service tunnels were locked down tight. Valerius was thorough. Mason had to give him that. "Think, Kane," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "There's always another way." He pulled up a mental map of the facility's infrastructure. The power distribution system ran throughout Atlas Command like a circulatory system, with redundant pathways designed to prevent total failure during an attack. His initial sabotage had been calculated to cause disruption without critical damage, but now he needed something more targeted. Mason crawled backward through the shaft until he reached a junction point. A small access panel revealed the facility's secondary power distribution network, hundreds of color-coded cables running in neat bundles. The labels were barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. Sector 19 Primary, Environmental Control Bypass. Mason traced the cables with his fingers. Auxiliary power to hangar systems. His eyes narrowed as he located what he needed, a thick bundle marked with high-voltage warnings. These fed power to the electromagnetic locks on the hangar bay doors. In normal operation, they kept the massive doors sealed against the vacuum of space. During lockdown, they reinforced the mechanical bolts. If he could create a power surge in the right subsector, the safety systems would trigger, temporarily disengaging the electromagnetic locks while backup systems initialized. It would only create a window of a few seconds, but that might be enough. Mason pulled a multi-tool from his belt and carefully pried open the junction box controlling power flow to Sector 18, adjacent to the hangar bay. Inside was a maze of circuit boards and safety regulators. He identified the surge protector and removed it, then crossed two primary feeds. "This is going to hurt," he whispered, reaching for his stolen security badge. He placed it between the exposed contacts, creating a temporary bridge. The badge sparked violently, then melted as current surged through it. Mason jerked his hand back, narrowly avoiding a nasty burn. The junction box erupted in a shower of sparks, then began to smoke. Alarms, new ones, blared throughout the facility. "Power surge detected in Sector 18, announced the AI. "Emergency protocols engaged." Mason didn't wait to admire his handiwork. He scrambled through the maintenance shaft, following a route that would take him back toward Hangar Bay 7 from a different approach. The security teams would be responding to the new threat, temporarily drawing attention away from his target. As he moved, the security chatter confirmed his plan was working. "All teams in Sector 18, evacuate immediately. Electrical fire reported in Subjunction Alpha. Team Delta, redirect to contain the surge before it spreads to critical systems. Commander Valerius, we need to reroute power away from the affected areas." Mason allowed himself a grim smile. Valerius would recognize this as another diversion, but he couldn't ignore the risk of a cascading power failure. At minimum, he'd have to split his forces. A sudden tremor ran through the facility as power fluctuated across multiple sectors. The lights flickered, then stabilized at a lower intensity. Mason had counted on the automated safety systems to compartmentalize the surge, but the damage from his earlier sabotage had compromised those systems. The power surge was spreading faster than anticipated. Warning: critical power fluctuation detected in multiple sectors. Automated containment failing. Mason cursed under his breath. He'd meant to create a small window of opportunity, not trigger a facility-wide collapse. If the power grid failed completely, the hangar bay's emergency systems would seal it permanently, trapping him inside Atlas Command. He reached a vertical shaft and climbed down rapidly, using the service rungs embedded in the wall. 2 levels down, he emerged into a utility corridor that ran beneath the hangar floor. The tremors intensified. Above him, he could hear the groaning of massive machinery as the hangar's systems fought to maintain integrity. "Emergency power rerouting failed," announced the AI, its voice distorting. "Sectors 17 through 20 switching to isolated backup power." Perfect. The hangar would temporarily lose connection to the main security grid. Mason reached the access hatch that would take him up into Hangar Bay 7. It was secured with an electronic lock, now disabled by the power fluctuations. He pushed it open and climbed through, emerging behind a stack of cargo containers. The hangar was in chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows. Security personnel shouted orders as technicians worked frantically to stabilize the systems. Through it all, the Stardust Drifter sat waiting, its access ramp still sealed. And standing between Mason and his ship was Commander Valerius, his expression cold and calculating as he surveyed the hangar. "Find our ghost," Valerius ordered the security teams. "He'll use this disruption to make his move." Mason pressed himself deeper into the shadows. Valerius had anticipated his strategy, but the commander couldn't be everywhere at once. All Mason needed was one moment of distraction, one blind spot in their coverage. The facility trembled again as another power junction failed. The klaxons in subsector 19 wailed at a different pitch than those in the hangar bay. Higher, more urgent. The sound cut through the chaos like a knife, drawing the attention of everyone in the hangar, including Valerius. The commander's comm unit crackled. "Sir, we've got electrical fire spreading through the tertiary power junctions. Environmental systems in subsector 19 are failing." Valerius's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of his frustration. "Casualties? None reported yet, but we've got research personnel trapped in the labs. Fire suppression is offline." Mason watched from his position behind the cargo containers as Valerius considered the situation. The commander's eyes swept across the hangar one final time, lingering on the Stardust drifter. He knew, Mason was certain of it, that this was another diversion. "Team Bravo," Valerius finally said into his comm, "redirect to subsector 19, extract any trapped personnel and contain the electrical fires before they reach the oxygen recycling systems." "Sir," protested the team leader, "that leaves us short-handed here. If the saboteur—" "I'm aware of the risk, Lieutenant." Valerius's voice was sharp as a blade. "But I won't sacrifice lives for the sake of one fugitive. Move out." 6 security officers peeled away from their positions, double-timing it toward the exit. Mason tracked their movement, calculating how their absence changed the security coverage in the hangar. The remaining guards adjusted their positions, trying to compensate for the sudden gap in their perimeter, but they couldn't cover everything. A weak point was forming, a narrow corridor between a refueling station and a stack of replacement parts. If Mason timed it right, he could sprint across 20 meters of open space to reach the Stardust drifter's access ramp. The only problem was Valerius himself, who stood almost directly in that path, issuing commands to the remaining security teams. Mason needed one more distraction. The facility shuddered again as another power junction failed. The lights in the hangar dimmed, then brightened, the fluctuations creating a disorienting strobe effect. Perfect cover for movement. Mason reached into his pocket and removed a small device, a remote trigger he'd prepared as a contingency. He hadn't planned to use it. The resulting chaos would make his escape more difficult. But Valerius had forced his hand. During his earlier sabotage of the power grid, Mason had placed small electromagnetic pulse charges at key junctions. He'd intended them as a last resort, a way to create total darkness if he needed to escape in the confusion. Triggering them now would disable all electronic systems in the immediate vicinity, including the hangar bay controls. Mason hesitated, thumb hovering over the trigger. The pulse would also affect the Stardust drifter systems. He'd have to initiate the launch sequence manually, working by emergency lighting alone. It would cost precious seconds. But as Valerius directed a guard to check the very cargo containers where Mason was hiding, the decision made itself. Mason pressed the trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the lights throughout the hangar died completely. Emergency systems failed to activate. Security barriers powered down with hydraulic sighs. Even the alarms fell silent, creating an eerie, absolute quiet. Into that silence came Valerius's voice, calm and cold. "Auxiliary lighting, now." But before the guards could respond, Mason was moving. He burst from his hiding place, sprinting through the darkness toward where he knew the Stardust drifter waited. His eyes, already adjusted to the dim light, picked out shapes in the darkness, crates, equipment, the silhouettes of confused guards. "He's here," someone shouted. Movement by the cargo containers. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping wildly across the hangar floor. It caught Mason for a split second, illuminating him mid-stride. There, by the refueling station. Mason changed direction, ducking behind a fuel pump as a guard fired blindly in his direction. The shot went wide, impacting somewhere in the darkness behind him. "Hold your fire, you fool." Valerius's voice rang out. "You'll blow the whole hangar." The momentary confusion was all Mason needed. He darted from cover, running full tilt toward the Stardust drifter. The ship's outline was barely visible in the darkness, but Mason had memorized its position down to the meter. More flashlight beams crisscrossed the hangar now, as guards struggled to track his movement. Mason zigzagged between them, using the chaotic lighting to his advantage. 20 meters became 15, then 10. He was going to make it. "All exits sealed," Valerius commanded. "Override the hangar doors. Don't let that ship launch. 5 meters to the access ramp. Mason could almost feel the freedom waiting beyond those hangar doors. Then a single flashlight beam found him, holding steady on his back as he ran. And behind the light stood Commander Valerius, his sidearm aimed with deadly precision. Mason counted to 20 after the patrol disappeared around the corner, then eased the access panel open and slid out of the alcove. His muscles ached from being compressed in the cramped space, but he pushed the discomfort aside. The clock was ticking. The corridor stretched before him, bathed in pulsing red emergency lighting. Signs of evacuation were everywhere: dropped personal items, abandoned security stations, doors left ajar in haste. The once orderly heart of Atlas Command had descended into controlled chaos, exactly as he'd planned. Mason moved with purpose, adopting the confident stride of someone who belonged there. In emergencies, people rarely questioned those who looked like they knew where they were going. He passed several groups of evacuating personnel, keeping his head down and his pace steady. "Complete system failure in sections 16 through 19, a technician was saying as Mason walked past. "Never seen anything like it." "They're saying it's deliberate sabotage," her companion replied, voice hushed. "Someone hit us from the inside." Mason suppressed a smile as he rounded a corner into a less crowded section. A directional sign indicated Hangar Bay 7 was just 2 levels below his current position. He'd memorized 3 potential routes during his planning phase, and the nearest access point was just ahead, a maintenance elevator reserved for engineering staff. The elevator required security clearance, but the emergency protocols had defaulted most systems to minimal security settings. Mason swiped his stolen badge, and the doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, he jabbed the button for the hangar level. As the elevator began its descent, Mason leaned against the wall and took his first deep breath since the alarms had started. So far, his plan was working. The cascading power failure had created exactly the kind of confusion he needed. Security teams spread thin, communications disrupted, evacuation protocols pulling personnel away from his target. The elevator slowed, then stopped 1 level above the hangars. The doors remained closed as an automated voice announced, "Level access restricted. Security authorization required." Mason frowned. Someone, probably Valerius, had managed to restore some of the security protocols. He pried open the maintenance panel beside the control console and examined the emergency override. A simple mechanical release would allow him to continue to the hangar level, but it would also trigger additional alarms. At this point, subtlety was less important than speed. Mason pulled the emergency release. Alarms blared as the elevator lurched downward, completing its journey to the hangar level. When the doors opened, he was greeted by the sight of a wide corridor leading toward the hangar bays. Direction markers on the floor pointed toward different sections. Hangar bays 1 through 10 were arranged in sequence, with bay 7 near the center of the complex. 2 security officers stood at an intersection ahead, their attention focused on a commotion in another corridor. Mason ducked into a storage alcove, weighing his options. He could backtrack and find another route, but time was running short. The direct approach might be better. He straightened his stolen uniform and strode forward with purpose. As he approached the guards, he called out, "Security breach in Sector 16. Commander Valerius needs reinforcements immediately." The guards exchanged glances. "We're stationed here by direct order," one replied, suspicion evident in his tone. "The situation's escalated," Mason countered, not breaking stride. "Multiple infiltrators detected. All available personnel are being redirected." The second guard hesitated, then raised his comm unit. Confirming new orders from command, Mason didn't wait for him to finish. He sprinted forward, closing the distance before either guard could react. A swift strike to the first guard's solar plexus doubled him over, and Mason used the momentum to drive his elbow into the man's temple. As the first guard crumpled, the second reached for his weapon. Too slow. Mason swept the guard's legs, sending him crashing to the floor, then delivered a precise blow to the base of his skull. Both guards lay unconscious, but alive. Mason had no desire to kill anyone today. He just needed them out of his way. He dragged the guards into the storage alcove, securing them with their own restraints. Neither would wake for at least 20 minutes, and by then, Mason planned to be long gone. Back in the corridor, He moved with renewed urgency. Signs indicated Hangar Bay 7 was just ahead. The massive hangar doors were visible now, partially open despite the lockdown protocols. Through the gap, Mason could see his ticket to freedom, the battered hull of the Stardust Drifter sitting untouched amid the chaos. For the first time since beginning this insane plan, Mason allowed himself a genuine smile. The path was clear. Freedom was within reach. He just had to make it across the hangar bay without running into Commander Valerius. Chapter 3. The Rogue Sentinel. The smile evaporated from Mason's face as the hangar door suddenly groaned to a halt. Red warning lights flashed along its frame, and the gap, already narrow, began to close with mechanical precision. Override initiated. Hangar Bay 7 lockdown protocol engaged, announced a synthetic voice over the facility-wide comms. Mason swore under his breath. Someone in command had figured out his destination and was sealing his escape route. He sprinted toward the diminishing gap, calculating whether he could squeeze through before it closed completely. In the command center, Commander Valerius stood rigid before a bank of flickering monitors. His weathered face, illuminated by emergency lighting, betrayed nothing as he processed the latest security updates. 3 teams had failed to intercept the intruder. The saboteur was slippery, clearly someone with insider knowledge of Atlas Command's layout and protocols. "He's heading for Hangar Bay 7, Valerius announced, eyes fixed on a thermal imaging feed showing a lone heat signature moving through maintenance corridors. "And he's moving too fast for our teams to intercept." Lieutenant Drayson approached with a tablet. "Sir, we've managed to initiate the hangar lockdown. Bay doors are sealing now." Valerius nodded but didn't look satisfied. "It won't be enough. This intruder has contingencies." He turned to a secure console and entered his command authorization. Time to change the game. The console illuminated with a prompt. "Sentinel unit deployment. Confirm." Valerius pressed his palm against the scanner. Authorization: Valerius Commander, Security Override Theta 9. Deep within Atlas Command Security Hub, mechanical systems whirred to life. A reinforced chamber depressurized with a hiss as its armored door retracted. Inside, a humanoid machine stood dormant, its matte black carapace absorbing the dim red light. Designation: SD-07. The Sentinel drone was Atlas Command's ultimate security measure, reserved for only the most serious breaches. "Deploy Sentinel to Hangar Bay 7 access corridors," Valerius commanded. "Autonomous tracking, non-lethal restraint protocols." Drayson shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, in these power conditions, the Sentinel's friend or foe systems might be compromised." "Then our personnel should stay clear of the target zone," Valerius replied coldly. "I want this intruder contained, whatever it takes." Mason abandoned his direct approach to the hangar doors when he saw they would close before he reached them. Instead, he veered into a utility passage that ran parallel to the hangar bay, a secondary route he'd identified during his planning. The passage would lead to a maintenance access point inside the hangar itself. The corridor ahead plunged into darkness as another power sector failed. Mason slowed his pace, navigating by the dim emergency lights that cast long shadows across the floor. The facility had gone eerily quiet, the distant alarms muffled by thick bulkheads. Something wasn't right. The security response had been too coordinated, too focused. Someone was anticipating his moves. A metallic click echoed from somewhere behind him, followed by the soft whir of servos. Mason froze, straining to listen. The sound was unfamiliar, not the footsteps of security personnel or the clatter of standard security drones. Another click, closer this time. Then silence. Mason pressed himself against the wall and held his breath. The darkness ahead seemed to shift, a deeper shadow moving against the black. A faint red glow appeared, an optical sensor scanning the corridor. The Sentinel drone stepped into a patch of emergency lighting, its armored form designed for both speed and power. Unlike the standard security units, this machine moved with fluid precision, each step calculated and silent. Its featureless head swiveled toward Mason's position, sensors probing the darkness. Mason had heard rumors about these units, but never encountered one. Sentinel drones were military-grade, equipped with advanced targeting systems and multiple weapon configurations. They could track by heat signature, motion, and even respiration patterns. If it had locked onto his position, running would be pointless. Mason remained perfectly still, As the drone's optical sensor swept past his location, the machine paused, then continued down the corridor, moving away from him. It hadn't detected him yet. When the drone disappeared around a corner, Mason released his breath. He needed to reach the hangar immediately, before the machine doubled back. The maintenance access was just ahead, but using it would expose him momentarily. It was a risk he had to take. Mason moved silently toward the access hatch, aware that somewhere in the darkness, the Sentinel was hunting him. As he reached for the hatch controls, a red dot appeared on the back of his hand, the drone's targeting laser. He'd been found. Mason lunged for the access hatch, fingers flying across the keypad. The panel beeped in rejection. Security protocols had changed during the lockdown. The targeting laser danced across his chest as he abandoned the keypad and pried at the manual release instead. Metal groaned as the emergency lever gave way, the hatch sliding open with agonizing slowness. The Sentinel's optical array flared bright red. It raised an arm, and a compartment slid open to reveal a non-lethal capture net launcher. Mason dove through the half-open hatch as the launcher fired with a pneumatic hiss. The weighted net struck the edge of the hatch, its electroshock nodes sparking wildly against the metal frame. He slammed the hatch shut behind him and twisted the manual lock. The drone's fist hammered against the other side, denting the reinforced metal inward. "Not today, you tin bastard," Mason muttered. The maintenance passage opened into a narrow service tunnel that ran beneath the hangar floor. Emergency lights cast the tunnel in a sickly amber glow, revealing exposed piping and bundled cables. Mason sprinted along the cramped space, hunched over to avoid banging his head on the low ceiling. Behind him, the rhythmic pounding against the hatch suddenly stopped. Silence. The drone had changed tactics. Mason quickened his pace. The service tunnel would lead to an access point inside Hangar Bay 7, bringing him out near the starboard side of the Stardust Drifter. If the ship hadn't been moved, he could be on board in minutes. The tunnel took a sharp turn left, and Mason followed it, only to skid to a halt at what lay beyond. A larger junction chamber opened before him, filled with cargo crates stacked in haphazard columns. Perfect cover, or a perfect place for an ambush. Mason crouched low, scanning the dimly lit chamber. Security often stored confiscated equipment in these junction rooms. If he could find something useful. A faint whirring sound echoed from somewhere among the crates. Mason froze, eyes tracking to the source of the noise. Nothing moved in the shadows, but the sound persisted, mechanical joints adjusting, servos realigning. The Sentinel had found another way in. Mason pressed his back against a tall cargo container, controlling his breathing. The ambient hum of emergency systems and distant alarms provided some cover, but the drone's audio sensors would be calibrated to filter out background noise. He inched along the container's edge, peering around the corner. The chamber remained still, filled with looming shadows. The whirring had stopped. A soft metallic click echoed from his right. Mason pulled back just as a beam of cold blue light swept across the space he'd occupied a moment before. The drone's optical sensor was scanning methodically between the crates, creating a three-dimensional map of the chamber. Mason ducked low and scurried to another stack of containers, moving while the sensor was pointed away. He needed to reach the far side of the chamber, where the hangar access hatch waited, but the drone stood directly in his path. The blue light swept around again, closer this time. Mason slipped behind a shorter crate, practically lying flat against the floor. The light passed overhead, missing him by inches. He spotted a gap between two large containers that might provide a path to the access hatch. 20 meters of exposed space, then freedom. Mason waited for the sensor beam to swing away, then made his move. He'd covered half the distance when the whirring sound suddenly intensified. The Sentinel had accelerated its scanning pattern, the blue light strobing rapidly across the chamber. Mason dove behind the nearest crate as the beam slashed through the air where he'd been. The drone knew he was here. A metallic thunk echoed through the chamber as something small and cylindrical rolled across the floor, coming to rest near Mason's position. A reconnaissance orb, a smaller drone that would flush him out. The orb activated with a high-pitched whine, rising to hover at chest height. Its crimson sensor array spun in a full circle, mapping every corner of the immediate area. Mason remained perfectly still, barely breathing as the orb floated closer. The small drone paused, its sensors fixed directly on his hiding spot. Mason tensed, ready to move. The orb chirped twice, target confirmation. Mason grabbed a loose pipe fitting from the floor and hurled it across the chamber. It clattered loudly against the far wall. The orb swiveled toward the sound, hesitating for a crucial second. In that moment, Mason sprang from cover and sprinted for the access hatch. Behind him, the orb emitted a shrill alarm. The main Sentinel drone appeared from behind a tall container, its optical sensor locking onto Mason's back. Mason reached the hatch and wrenched it open, diving through as the Sentinel's arm transformed into a sonic disruptor. The weapon discharged with a deafening pulse that missed Mason by millimeters, shattering a section of wall instead. The hatch sealed behind him with a satisfying clunk. Mason found himself in the hangar at last. The Stardust Drifter's familiar silhouette waiting in the dim emergency lighting. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he pressed his back against the hangar wall. The Stardust Drifter sat tantalizingly close, a sleek, battle-scarred freighter with mismatched hull plates and a modified engine array that could outrun most military pursuit craft. Just 50 meters of open hangar floor between him and freedom. 50 meters of completely exposed space. The overhead emergency lights flickered, plunging sections of the hangar into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. The power grid was still destabilizing, creating a strobe-like effect across the vast chamber. In the stuttering light, Mason spotted movement at the far side of the hangar, security personnel taking defensive positions behind cargo loaders and fuel tanks. A heavy metallic thud echoed through the hangar as a maintenance hatch burst open. The Sentinel drone emerged, its optical sensor swiveling methodically to scan the area. Unlike the human security team, it moved with cold precision, each step calculated to maximize coverage of potential escape routes. Mason ducked behind a stack of cargo containers as the drone's sensor swept in his direction. The machine paused, its head tilting slightly as though puzzled by something its sensors had detected. Then it adjusted course, moving directly toward Mason's position. "Stars damn," he whispered. The emergency lights flickered again, longer this time, casting the hangar in darkness for nearly 3 seconds. Mason seized the opportunity, abandoning his hiding spot and sprinting silently to a refueling station 10 meters closer to his ship. He slid into cover just as the lights sputtered back, revealing his previous position, now empty. The Sentinel froze, its optical array flaring bright red. It had registered the change. With mechanical efficiency, it began quartering the area, methodically eliminating possible hiding spots. Each step brought it closer to Mason's new position. Another flicker. 2 seconds of darkness. Mason remained motionless. Moving now would be suicide. The drone's thermal imaging would catch the motion instantly in the darkness. Instead, he removed his jacket and tossed it in the opposite direction. It landed with a soft thump, just as the lights returned. The Sentinel's head snapped toward the sound, optical sensors narrowing to focus on the discarded jacket. It approached cautiously, weapon systems primed. When it reached the garment, a manipulator arm extended to probe the fabric. The lights died again, 5 seconds of perfect darkness. Mason moved like liquid shadow, sliding from cover to cover, using the remembered layout of the hangar to guide him. 20 meters closer to the ship. He reached a fuel pump station and ducked beneath its control panel, making himself as small as possible. When the lights returned, the Sentinel stood motionless, scanning in a complete 360-degree arc. Its programming had recognized the diversion tactic. It was adapting, learning his patterns. Hangar pressurization commencing for emergency protocol, announced the facility's automated system. Complete evacuation required in 60 seconds. They were going to vent the hangar to space. Mason glanced at the Stardust Drifter, 15 meters away now. The boarding ramp was down, ready for his final sprint. The drone emitted a series of clicks as it recalibrated its sensors. It was switching to heat signature tracking, rendering the light fluctuations irrelevant. The machine took a deliberate step toward the fuel station, its optical sensor fixed on Mason's hiding spot. It had found him. The lights flickered once more. 3 seconds of darkness. Mason remained perfectly still, knowing movement would only confirm his position to the heat-tracking sensors. When the lights returned, the sentinel stood 5 meters away, its weapon arm raised and aimed directly at him. Behind it, Mason noticed something he'd missed before. A pressure valve on one of the fuel lines, glowing with a soft amber warning light. The instability in the power grid had affected the fuel system's safety protocols. Mason smiled grimly. "Let's see how your heat sensors handle this." The next blackout lasted barely 2 seconds, just enough time for Mason to pull his hidden sidearm and aim at the pressure valve. When the lights returned, he fired a single shot. The valve erupted in a violent spray of pressurized fuel, engulfing the area in a cloud of supercooled vapor. Alarms wailed as emergency containment systems activated. The Sentinel's sensors went haywire, bombarded with rapidly changing temperature signatures as the cryogenic fuel dissipated throughout the area. Mason broke cover, sprinting through the vapor cloud toward his ship. The drone fired blindly, sonic pulses missing him by meters as its targeting systems struggled to compensate for the thermal chaos. 30 seconds to hangar depressurization, warned the automated system. Mason reached the boarding ramp and vaulted up its length, slapping the control panel as he passed. The ramp began to close as he threw himself into the pilot's seat and initiated the startup sequence. Outside, the vapor cloud had begun to dissipate. The Sentinel emerged from the mist, optical sensor locked on the ship, weapon arm reconfiguring for maximum power output. The engines roared to life as Mason's fingers danced across the controls. The ship lifted off just as the drone fired, the pulse dissipating harmlessly against the drifter's shields. 20 seconds to depressurization. Mason gunned the engines, angling the ship toward the still-sealed hangar doors. If his calculations were correct, the depressurization sequence would open those doors just wide enough. The ship's diagnostics flashed red across the console. The Sentinel's weapon pulse hadn't penetrated the shields, but it had disrupted the drifter's navigation systems. Mason cursed as he wrestled with the controls, the ship lurching sideways and scraping against a stack of supply crates. 15 seconds to depressurization. Through the view screen, Mason spotted movement at the hangar's main entrance. A security team had arrived, taking position behind reinforced barriers. Leading them was a tall figure whose bearing commanded attention even at this distance. Commander Valerius himself, directing his forces with cold precision. Mason recognized the tactical formation. They weren't trying to stop him from reaching the doors. They were hurting him. The realization hit like ice water. The lockdown? The Sentinel, the timed depressurization, it wasn't about preventing his escape. It was about forcing him to take the only route they'd left open. Void-cursed trap, Mason muttered, eyes darting across the hangar layout. The main doors would open just enough during depressurization to allow a ship through, right into the waiting guns of whatever strike force Valerius had positioned outside. The Sentinel drone had recovered from the thermal confusion and was advancing again, this time accompanied by 2 security officers in environmental suits. They were boxing him in, eliminating options. 10 seconds to depressurization. Mason swung the ship around, scanning for alternatives. The hangar walls were reinforced titanium alloy, the ceiling rigged with emergency force fields. The floor. There, near the central refueling station, a maintenance access panel barely visible beneath years of grime and wear. It led to the facility's primary plasma distribution network, the same system Mason had compromised to trigger the initial blackout. He brought the drifter down hard, landing just meters from the access panel. Security immediately opened fire, energy bolts pinging harmlessly off the ship's shields. The Sentinel advanced methodically, its weapon arm reconfigured to fire a concentrated EMP burst that could disable the drifter's systems. 5 seconds to depressurization. Mason yanked on an environment suit and grabbed his multi-tool from the emergency kit. No time for second thoughts. He slammed the external hatch release and dropped to the hangar floor, rolling behind a fuel pump as shots tracked his movement. The access panel was 3 meters away, 3 meters of completely exposed ground. The Sentinel locked onto his position, its optical array flaring bright as it calculated the perfect shot. Mason feinted left, then dove right as the drone fired. The EMP burst missed him by centimeters, striking the fuel pump instead. Systems shorted out in a shower of sparks, temporarily blinding the security team. He reached the access panel and wrenched it open with the multi-tool. Below, the plasma distribution conduits glowed with blue-white energy, the lifeblood of the facility's power grid. Depressurization commencing. A high-pitched whine filled the hangar as the atmosphere began venting. Loose items started sliding toward the partially opening main doors. The security team braced against their barriers, environmental suits keeping them anchored as the air rushed past. Mason's own suit strained against the pull, its magnetic boots barely maintaining contact with the floor. The Sentinel remained perfectly stable, its heavy frame unmoved by the escaping atmosphere. It advanced toward him, weapon primed for a killing shot. There would be no outrunning it. No clever maneuver to escape its targeting systems. The drone had adapted to every trick, predicted every move. Mason stared at the pulsing plasma conduit beneath the access panel. One of the lines had already been damaged during his earlier sabotage, a hairline fracture leaking energy in faint blue wisps. A desperate plan formed in his mind. Using the multi-tool's precision cutter, Mason carefully widened the fracture in the damaged conduit. The plasma leak intensified, energy crackling dangerously around the opening. Mason adjusted the flow, creating an unstable pocket of superheated plasma that bulged outward like a balloon ready to burst. The Sentinel was 5 meters away now, its optical sensors analyzing the plasma leak. For the first time, the machine hesitated, its threat assessment algorithms detecting the imminent danger. Mason backed away slowly, stepping around the corner of the refueling station. The plasma pocket continued to grow, distorting the air around it with waves of heat. Even through his environmental suit, Mason could feel the temperature rising to lethal levels. The Sentinel resumed its advance, apparently calculating that the plasma leak posed less immediate threat than allowing Mason to escape. It rounded the corner of the refueling station, weapon arm raised, and found itself facing the fully exposed, catastrophically unstable plasma pocket. Mason ducked behind a support column as the pocket ruptured with explosive force. A blinding flash of blue-white energy engulfed the Sentinel, melting through its reinforced carapace like paper. The blast wave rippled outward, shattering equipment and knocking security personnel off their feet. In the chaos, Mason sprinted back to the drifter, the hangar now half depressurized and filling with emergency containment foam. He clambered up the boarding ramp and sealed it behind him, throwing himself into the pilot's seat. Through the dissipating energy discharge, he spotted Commander Valerius, still standing, still watching with calculating eyes as Mason fired up the engines once more. The Sentinel paused, its optical array pulsing as it processed new environmental data. Energy readings from the damaged conduit had spiked beyond normal parameters. Its threat assessment algorithms recalculated priorities, the plasma leak now registered as a potential system-wide hazard. Mason remained motionless behind the support column, watching through a reflection in a broken monitor panel. The drone's head swiveled with mechanical precision, scanning the surrounding area in expanding circles. It had lost visual confirmation of his position, but continued methodically eliminating possible hiding spots. A drop of sweat trickled down Mason's temple despite the environmental suit's cooling systems. The atmosphere in the hangar had thinned considerably, objects continuing to slide toward the partially open bay doors. Warning klaxons echoed through the vast space, their sound distorted by the decreasing air pressure. The drone took a deliberate step forward, its heavy frame adjusting to compensate for the pull of the escaping atmosphere. Another step. It was approaching the damaged conduit, optical sensors fixed on the hairline fracture Mason had widened. Blue-white energy leaked from the crack, creating a shimmering haze in the air. Mason glanced at the floor near his feet. A twisted piece of metal plating, torn loose during the earlier chaos, lay within reach. About 30 centimeters long, with jagged edges where it had been wrenched from its moorings. Heavy enough to fly true, light enough to throw with precision. The Sentinel advanced to within 2 meters of the conduit, its sensor array tilted downward, analyzing the leak pattern. The machine's programming recognized the danger but calculated the risk as manageable. The fracture hadn't yet reached critical instability. Mason's fingers closed around the metal plating, testing its weight. The drone's back was to him now, its attention fully focused on the plasma leak. One chance, one throw. He drew a deep breath, calculating trajectory against the thinning atmosphere and shifting pressure gradients. The magnetic boots of his suit disengaged with a soft click as he shifted his weight to his back foot. Mason stepped out from behind the column, arm already in motion. The metal plating sailed through the air, spinning end over end, its jagged edge catching the emergency lighting in brief, deadly flashes. The Sentinel's threat detection systems registered the movement too late. It began to turn, weapon arm rising, but the metal plating had already struck its target. The jagged edge slammed into the plasma conduit precisely where the fracture was widest. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the containment field collapsed. Blue-white energy erupted outward in a concentrated wave, striking the Sentinel directly in its exposed flank. The machine's reinforced carapace glowed white-hot as plasma energy melted through layers of advanced composites and circuitry. Its optical array flared blindingly bright, then went dark as critical systems failed. The blast wave expanded in a perfect sphere, superheated plasma converting the surrounding air into a momentary firestorm. Mason threw himself backward, the force of the explosion sending him tumbling despite his magnetic boots re-engaging to stabilize him. He slammed against a cargo container, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The environmental suit's external temperature sensors maxed out instantly, emergency warnings flashing across his heads-up display. Through the visor, he watched the Sentinel drone topple backward, its once pristine carapace now a twisted, molten ruin. Secondary explosions ripped through nearby equipment as power relays overloaded. The security team scattered, abandoning their positions as containment foam dispensers activated, spraying the area with fire-suppressing chemicals. Alarms changed pitch, shifting from evacuation warnings to critical system failure alerts. The plasma discharge had subsided to a fierce glow centered around the ruined conduit. Emergency force fields flickered to life, containing the worst of the damage, but struggling against the fluctuating power levels. Through gaps in the chaos, Mason could see Commander Valerius shouting orders, his face illuminated by the pulsing emergency lights. Mason pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain lancing through his right shoulder. The Stardust Drifter waited 20 meters away, its boarding ramp still extended. The path between was momentarily clear as security forces regrouped to deal with the immediate danger of the plasma breach. He sprinted across the hangar floor, environment suit whining as it compensated for the thinning atmosphere. Behind him, the damaged plasma conduit ruptured further, another surge of energy breaking through the emergency containment fields. The distraction was perfect. All attention focused on preventing a catastrophic breach that could compromise the entire facility. Mason reached the boarding ramp in 4 long strides, throwing himself up its length and into the ship's airlock. The outer door sealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Inside, emergency systems deactivated his environment suit as he staggered to the cockpit. The Drifter's engines roared to life at his command, primary systems online and ready. Through the view screen, Mason saw the hangar in disarray. Security personnel battling the plasma breach, foam dispensers working overtime, and Commander Valerius standing apart from the chaos, staring directly at the ship with cold fury in his eyes. Mason's hands flew across the controls, navigation systems plotting a course toward the partially open hangar doors. The ship lifted smoothly from the deck, turning to face its escape route. The Sentinel's feed sputtered and died on every screen in the security hub. Technicians scrambled to restore the connection, their fingers dancing across consoles while error messages flooded their displays. The drone's vital systems, a marvel of military engineering designed to withstand artillery fire, had been reduced to molten scrap in seconds. Commander Valerius stood motionless before the central monitor, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh glow of emergency lighting. The static-filled screen reflected in his steel-gray eyes, which narrowed almost imperceptibly as understanding dawned. His fist came down on the console with controlled violence. Not a mindless explosion of anger, but the precise application of force born from cold calculation. "Pull up the intruder's movement patterns," he ordered, voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "All camera feeds, all sensor data. Now." A junior analyst swiveled in her chair. Sir, with the power fluctuations, we've lost 60% of. Use what we have. Valerius cut her off without raising his voice. This isn't some common smuggler or corporate spy. We're dealing with a professional. The remaining screens flickered to life, displaying fragmented security footage from throughout the facility. Valerius studied the images with clinical detachment, the methodical sabotage of power junctions, the precise timing of the blackouts, the calculated path through maintenance tunnels that had evaded standard patrol routes. Look at his movements, Valerius murmured, more to himself than to his staff. He's not just familiar with our layout, he knows our protocols, our response patterns. His finger traced the intruder's path across the display. These aren't the actions of someone working from stolen schematics. This is muscle memory. Lieutenant Drayson approached, datapad in hand. Sir, we've managed to isolate a partial facial recognition match from a maintenance corridor camera. Valerius took the datapad, eyes narrowing as he studied the grainy image. The intruder had kept his face hidden from most cameras, but one frame had captured him in profile for a fraction of a second, just enough for the system to generate a potential match. Run it against TSC personnel records, Valerius ordered. Current and former. Already did, sir. Drayson's voice dropped lower. That's why I brought it directly to you. The system flagged it as classified. We need alpha-level clearance to access the file. Valerius's expression hardened. He entered his command authorization, pressed his palm against the scanner, and watched as the datapad processed his credentials. The screen flashed briefly, then displayed a single personnel file with most sections heavily redacted. Kane Mason. Operative status revoked. Security classification, Omega Black. A black and red warning banner flashed across the file. Capture or terminate on site. Extreme caution advised. Valerius's thumb hovered over the file for a moment before he closed it. Seal all outgoing communications channels. This information doesn't leave this room. Sir? Drayson looked confused. Protocol requires immediate notification to Central Command for Omega Black. I'm aware of protocol, Lieutenant. Valerius handed the datapad back. But right now, we have a more immediate concern. Kane is heading for the Stardust Drifter, and he knows exactly how to fly it. In the hangar bay, Mason guided the Stardust Drifter through billowing clouds of containment foam and emergency vapor. The ship's thrusters whined as he pushed them beyond safe operational parameters, systems protesting with a series of urgent warnings that he promptly ignored. Through the viewport, he could see the hangar doors, still only partially open from the interrupted depressurization sequence. A gap barely wide enough for the drifter to squeeze through, leading to open space and freedom. Warning lights flashed across his console as automated defense systems activated. Turrets emerged from concealed ports in the hangar ceiling, tracking the ship's movement with deadly precision. Mason's fingers flew across the controls, bypassing safety protocols and rerouting power from non-essential systems to the shields. He'd helped design these defense systems years ago, knew their targeting algorithms, their response times, their blind spots. The first turret fired, energy bolts splashing against the drifter's reinforced bow shields. Mason banked hard, angling the ship's profile to present the smallest possible target while maintaining his course toward the gap. The second and third turrets opened fire in sequence, their targeting computers predicting his evasive pattern with uncanny accuracy. An alert blared through the cockpit, shield integrity at 60% and dropping. Mason pushed the thrust lever forward, sending the ship into a controlled spin that disrupted the turret's targeting solutions. The maneuver would have torn apart a standard freighter, but the drifter was far from standard. Its reinforced frame groaned but held as centrifugal forces threatened to rip panels from the hull. The gap in the hangar doors loomed closer, a rectangle of star-speckled blackness against the chaos of the bay. Mason aligned the ship's trajectory, calculating clearances to within centimeters. Too high or too low, and the drifter would crash into reinforced titanium, ending his escape in a ball of fire. As the ship shot toward the opening, Mason caught a final glimpse of Commander Valerius through the viewport. The man stood at the edge of the hangar floor, environmental suit in place, staring up at the fleeing vessel with cold determination. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, recognition passing between them like an electric current. Then the Stardust Drifter slipped through the gap, scraping its belly against the lower edge with a sound like tearing metal. Emergency thrusters fired automatically, compensating for the impact and stabilizing the ship's flight path. The vast emptiness of space enveloped the vessel, stars stretching out in endless formation as Mason pushed the engines to maximum thrust. Behind him, Atlas Command diminished rapidly, its imposing silhouette reduced to a distant outpost against the galactic backdrop. Mason allowed himself a tight smile as he plotted a course away from Atlas space. He was out, but judging by the look in Valerius's eyes, the hunt was just beginning. Chapter 4. Ignition Point. Mason eased the thrust back, crouching behind a stack of cargo containers as he surveyed the final obstacle between him and freedom. The hangar bay doors loomed ahead, but the route wasn't clear. 2 elite guards stood at attention beside the control panel, their posture rigid and alert despite the chaos erupting throughout the facility. Not regular security, these were Bastion operatives, elite soldiers equipped with augmented combat gear and neural-linked targeting systems. Their matte black armor absorbed the pulsing emergency lights, and the faceless helmets swiveled in precise, measured movements as they scanned the hangar. Mason recognized the customized pulse rifles they carried, military-grade weapons that could punch through reinforced hull plating, let alone human flesh. A direct confrontation would be suicide. "Stars damn Valerius," Mason muttered under his breath, always one step ahead. He assessed his options while counting down the seconds until the security systems would reset and seal the hangar permanently. Less than 90 seconds remaining. The Stardust Drifter sat tantalizingly close, its weathered hull practically gleaming under the emergency lights, but those guards might as well have been a fortress wall. Mason patted his pockets, taking inventory. A half-depleted multi-tool, an ID spoofer with maybe one good use left, and a compact plasma torch. Tools for infiltration, not assault. His gaze swept the hangar, searching for anything he could use. His attention locked onto a series of fuel lines running along the ceiling, emergency backup systems to feed the thrusters of ships during crisis launches. The lines connected to pressure tanks near where the guards stood. It wasn't a perfect plan, but perfect plans were a luxury he couldn't afford with the countdown ticking. Mason crept along the edge of the containers, keeping to the shadows. When he reached the service panel for the secondary fuel systems, he pried it open with his multi-tool and examined the tangle of wires inside. He located the pressure regulation circuit and carefully bypassed the safety protocols. 70 seconds. He glanced back at the guards. They remained stationed at the door, their weapons ready. Mason took a deep breath, calibrated the fuel pressure to rise gradually rather than spike, and triggered the override. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then a subtle vibration began in the pipes overhead, followed by a high-pitched whine that was barely audible above the facility's alarms. The guards didn't react immediately. The sound wasn't threatening enough to warrant investigation. Mason waited, timing his next move carefully. The pressure continued building in the system. 50 seconds. One of the guards finally tilted his helmet upward, alerted by the increasing whine from the pipes. He nudged his partner, and they both began scanning the ceiling. Mason activated his ID spoofer, setting it to broadcast a maintenance alert from the opposite side of the hangar. The device pinged loudly, drawing both guards' attention. They exchanged a brief communication, too quiet for Mason to hear, before one guard remained at the door, while the other moved to investigate. 40 seconds. The pressure in the fuel lines had reached critical levels. Mason crouched, ready to sprint, and placed his palm against the plasma torch. 30 seconds. When the remaining guard turned slightly to check on his partner's progress, Mason made his move. He dashed across the open space toward the drifter, staying low. The guard's helmet snapped toward the movement, rifle raising. Mason thumbed the plasma torch to life and hurled it upward with all his strength. The superheated tip sliced through the already strained fuel line, releasing a pressurized spray of highly flammable propellant. The torch's plasma core ignited the fuel instantly. Not an explosion. Mason had calibrated the pressure carefully, but a brilliant flash followed by a sustained jet of flame that erupted between Mason and the guards. The fire suppression systems activated immediately, filling the area with sound and foam. Mason used the distraction to sprint the final distance to the Stardust Drifter. Behind him, the guards fired blindly through the flames and foam, energy bolts sizzling past him. 20 seconds. Mason slapped his palm against the drifter's entry panel. The ramp descended with agonizing slowness, and he dove inside before it had fully extended. Rolling to his feet, he raced to the cockpit, fingers already flying across the startup sequence. The ship's systems came online just as the hangar bay began its final lockdown procedure. The massive doors started sliding closed, the gap narrowing with each passing second. Mason didn't hesitate. He punched the ignition before pre-flight checks were complete, and the engines roared to life. The drifter lurched forward, scraping against the hangar floor as Mason aimed for the rapidly closing exit. 10 seconds. The guards had recovered, their weapons tracking the accelerating ship. Energy bolts hammered against the drifter's shields as Mason pushed the throttle to maximum, aiming for the shrinking rectangle of stars beyond the hangar doors. Freedom was just meters away. Mason halted mid-stride, his gaze snapping upward to the network of maintenance catwalks and rafters crisscrossing the hangar ceiling. The fire suppression system controls would be up there. Standard protocol and military installations placed the override nodes above every major exit point. A better plan formed in his mind. Instead of charging through the guards, he'd go over them. Mason backtracked to a stack of supply crates, keeping low and in the shadows. He scaled the containers with practiced movements, fingers finding purchase in the slim gaps between metal panels. From the top of the highest crate, he made a controlled leap, catching the edge of the lowest catwalk with his fingertips. His muscles strained as he pulled himself up, moving with deliberate silence despite the blaring alarms. The metal grating beneath his feet vibrated with the facility's emergency systems. Mason kept his profile low, crawling on hands and knees across the elevated walkway that stretched above the docked vessels. 65 seconds remained. The catwalk branched into a maze of maintenance access points, each designed for technicians to service the overhead systems. Mason navigated by memory, recalling facility schematics he'd studied for weeks before the operation. 3 junctions in, then right at the power coupling. The guards below remained vigilant at their post, unaware of the figure moving in the shadowed heights above their position. Their helmets were designed for forward threat assessment, not for detecting movement above. Mason reached the central fire suppression node, a clustered array of pipes, valves, and control panels. He pried open the access hatch with his multi-tool, revealing a complex tangle of circuitry and pressure regulators. 50 seconds to lockdown, announced an automated voice throughout the hangar. The guards shifted nervously below, weapons held at ready position as they scanned the hangar floor. Mason worked quickly, fingers dancing across the control panel as he bypassed safety interlocks and overrode the automated sequences. He targeted 3 systems simultaneously. The fire suppressant foam dispensers directly above the guards, the emergency water sprinklers covering the path to his ship, and the backup fire alarm in the adjacent cargo area. With careful precision, he rewired the system to trigger them in sequence rather than simultaneously. 40 seconds to lockdown. Mason double-checked his work, then closed the panel. He crawled backward along the catwalk until he reached a position with a clear line of sight to the Stardust Drifter. The ship sat 30 meters away, its hull reflecting the pulsing red emergency lights. He pulled the multi-tool from his pocket once more, adjusted its settings to the highest electrical output, and pressed it against a junction box on the catwalk. The surge of power triggered his sabotage system. Below, the guard's position was suddenly engulfed in a thick cloud of chemical foam that poured from ceiling dispensers. The men shouted in surprise, their disciplined stance breaking as they stumbled backward, temporarily blinded by the deluge. Mason was already moving. He slid down a maintenance ladder, dropped the final few meters to the hangar floor, and sprinted through the clear path he'd created. Behind him, the foam continued to pour, and ahead, water sprinklers activated, creating a hazy curtain between him and potential reinforcements. 30 seconds to lockdown. The secondary fire alarm blared in the cargo area, its distinctive tone different from the main facility alarm. Mason heard shouts of confusion as security teams diverted to investigate the new threat. He reached the Stardust Drifter, slapping his palm against the entry scanner. The ship recognized his biometric signature, and the boarding ramp descended with a pneumatic hiss. Mason bounded up before it fully extended, sealing it behind him as he raced to the cockpit. The control panels lit up at his touch, systems initializing in emergency sequence. Through the view screen, Mason saw the guards finally emerging from the foam cloud, their armored forms dripping with chemical suppressant as they raised their weapons. 20 seconds to lockdown. The hangar doors began their final closure sequence, massive slabs of reinforced steel sliding together like the jaws of some mechanical beast. Mason bypassed the pre-flight checks and punched the ignition. The drifter's engines coughed once, then roared to life, vibrating through the ship's frame. Energy bolts from the guards' weapons sparked against the hull as Mason lifted the ship from its berth. He angled the thrusters, pushing the vessel toward the narrowing gap of stars beyond the doors. 10 seconds to lockdown. Mason gritted his teeth and pushed the throttle to maximum. The drifter lurched forward, acceleration pressing him back into the pilot's seat. The ship's underbelly scraped against the hangar floor, throwing sparks in its wake as it gathered speed. The guards continued firing, but their shots glanced off the ship's rear deflectors. The hangar doors were now less than 3 meters apart and closing fast. 5 seconds to lockdown. The Stardust drifter shot toward freedom, threading the needle between the massive doors with bare centimeters to spare on either side. Metal screeched against metal as the ship's hull plates grazed the doors. Then sudden silence as the drifter burst into open space, stars spreading out before it like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Mason slumped back in the pilot's seat, his heart hammering against his ribs as the Stardust drifter left Atlas Command behind. The ship rattled around him, protesting the abrupt launch and scrapes against the hangar doors. He checked the damage readouts, superficial hull breaches, nothing the auto-sealant couldn't handle. Proximity alert, chimed the ship's computer. Multiple vessels on intercept course. Through the view screen, Mason spotted them, security cutters launching from Atlas Command's orbital platforms. Sleek, purpose-built pursuit vessels with enough firepower to reduce the drifter to scattered atoms. Of course Valerius wouldn't make this easy, Mason muttered, fingers dancing across the control panels. He pushed the drifter's engines beyond recommended parameters, the ship groaning in protest as it accelerated away from the station. The security vessels followed suit, their superior engines quickly closing the gap. Warning lights flashed across Mason's console as the first targeting locks registered. Mason's eyes darted to the space ahead, calculating trajectories and scanning for options. A maintenance platform loomed in the distance, one of the orbital repair yards servicing command vessels. Perfect. He banked hard toward it, pushing the drifter into a steep dive that made the hull plates creak. The pursuing ships adjusted course, their formation tightening as they anticipated his route. Mason smiled grimly. They were exactly where he wanted them. The maintenance platform grew larger in his view screen, its skeletal structure housing multiple service bays. Massive tanks of fire suppression chemicals were mounted at regular intervals along its spine, standard safety protocols for orbital facilities where oxygen fires could be catastrophic. Mason targeted the nearest tank with the drifter's forward sensors, his thumb hovering over the weapon's trigger. He wasn't trying to destroy the platform, just create enough chaos to slip away. The drifter's targeting computer locked onto the tank's pressure release valve rather than the container itself. "Hope nobody's working overtime today," he muttered, then squeezed the trigger. A single energy pulse shot from the drifter's forward cannon, striking the valve with surgical precision. The pressure tank ruptured exactly as planned, releasing its contents in an explosive cloud of white chemical retardant. The cloud expanded rapidly in the vacuum, tiny ice crystals forming as the liquid components flash froze. Mason didn't hesitate. He cut thrust, spun the ship 180 degrees, and fired a second shot at another tank on the opposite side of the platform. Another cloud erupted, joining the first and creating a massive billowing nebula of frozen chemicals and ice particles. With a quick twist of the controls, Mason plunged the drifter directly into the expanding cloud. Visibility dropped to 0 as the ship was enveloped in swirling white particles that clattered against the hull like miniature hailstones. The security cutters followed, their pilots reluctant to lose visual contact with their quarry. As they entered the cloud, their sensors immediately began to falter. The mix of chemicals and ice created the perfect storm of interference, confusing targeting systems and blinding external cameras. Inside the lead cutter, guards cursed as their view screens filled with static. The particles clung to external sensor arrays, coating delicate equipment in a layer of frozen retardant that disrupted communication frequencies and scrambled targeting algorithms. Pilots struggled to maintain formation as visibility reduced to mere meters. "I've lost him," shouted one pilot over the comms, switching to thermal tracking. But Mason had anticipated this. The drifter's ventral heat sinks were already open, dumping excess thermal energy into space and reducing the ship's heat signature. To thermal sensors, the drifter would appear as nothing more than background radiation, indistinguishable from the frozen chemical cloud. Mason navigated by feel and memory, keeping the ship at minimal power as he guided it through the blinding fog. The guards' cutters moved like blinded predators, sweeping back and forth in desperate search patterns that took them further from his actual position. He watched on the rear scanners as the cutters collided with each other, their pilots disoriented by the chemical soup surrounding them. No serious damage, but enough confusion to buy precious seconds. Two cutters scraped against maintenance platform struts, triggering automated warnings and causing further chaos among the pursuit vessels. When Mason judged he'd created sufficient distance, he nudged the drifter toward the edge of the cloud. The ship emerged from the swirling white fog like a ghost, systems quickly reactivating as Mason restored full power. Before the guards could reacquire his position, he pushed the engines to maximum and set course away from Atlas Command. The chemical cloud continued expanding behind him, a brilliant white sphere against the blackness of space that effectively screened his escape. By the time the guards regained formation and cleared their sensors, the Stardust drifter would be well beyond immediate pursuit range. Mason allowed himself a moment's satisfaction as he plotted the jump coordinates. The trick had worked perfectly, but he knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Valerius wouldn't give up so easily, and this was only the beginning of what promised to be a very long chase. Mason's lungs burned as he sprinted across the hangar floor, boots skidding on the metal surface slick with fire-suppressant foam. Alarms continued to wail overhead, a chaotic symphony accompanying his desperate dash for freedom. The Stardust drifter loomed ahead, a battered hull of mismatched plates and outdated tech that somehow still managed to fly. To anyone else, it looked like junk. To Mason, it represented his only chance of escape. Behind him, shouts echoed as security forces regrouped. The chemical foam had bought him precious seconds, but they wouldn't stay disoriented for long. The massive hangar doors continued their inexorable closure, the gap shrinking with each passing moment. 10 seconds to complete lockdown, announced the facility's automated system, its feminine voice incongruously calm amid the chaos. Mason skidded to a halt at the drifter's access ramp, slapping his palm against the biometric scanner. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the scanner flashed green and the ramp began to lower with a reluctant hydraulic groan. "Come on, you void-cursed piece of," Mason growled, ducking under the still descending ramp rather than waiting for it to fully extend. The interior of the ship greeted him with stale art, recycled air, and the comforting smell of engine oil and metal. Mason slapped the internal panel to raise the ramp behind him, not waiting to see it close as he sprinted toward the cockpit. 7 seconds to lockdown. Mason threw himself into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the startup sequence. Ancient displays flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in a pale blue glow. The ship's systems responded sluggishly, as if reluctant to wake from hibernation. "Come on, old girl," Mason muttered, bypassing safety protocols and forcing emergency startup procedures. The drifter's engines coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a vibration that shook the entire frame. Outside, guards had regained their positions, pulse rifles raised and targeting the ship. 5 seconds to lockdown. Mason grabbed the control yoke with both hands, feeding power to the thrusters. The ship lurched forward, scraping against its docking clamps. A warning light flashed on the console. The docking arm was still attached. Mason punched the emergency release, and the clamp disengaged with a metallic clang that reverberated through the hull. Energy bolts from the guard's weapons splashed against the view screen, leaving scorch marks on the reinforced glass. The shields weren't fully charged yet, and each hit sent warning indicators blaring across the console. 3 seconds to lockdown? The hangar doors had narrowed to barely 10 meters, just wide enough for the drifter to pass through if Mason threaded the needle perfectly. He pushed the throttle to maximum, ignoring the ship's protests as the engines strained beyond safety parameters. The Stardust drifter shot forward, gathering speed as it raced toward the shrinking gap. Guards scattered from its path, diving for cover as the vessel barreled across the hangar floor. 1 second to lockdown. Mason's knuckles whitened on the controls as he made microscopic adjustments to the ship's trajectory. The massive doors loomed ahead, the space between them now barely wider than the drifter itself. There was no room for error. The ship screamed through the gap, metal shrieking against metal as the hull scraped along both doors. Sparks cascaded across the view screen, and damage alerts lit up the console like a festival display. For a terrible moment, Mason thought they might get stuck, crushed between the massive doors as they completed their closure. Then the drifter burst into open space, stars spreading out before it like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. But freedom was short-lived. The proximity alarm blared as defense turrets mounted on the station's exterior swiveled toward the escaping ship. The first volley of energy blasts rocked the drifter, shields flaring as they struggled to absorb the impacts. "Ship status?" Mason demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The console displayed a litany of damage reports: shield generators at 40% capacity, hull breaches on the starboard side already being patched by emergency sealant, and thrusters operating at dangerously high temperatures. Nothing fatal, but the drifter was hurting. More turret fire lanced through space around him as Mason executed a series of evasive maneuvers, pushing the ship into a tight spiral that strained both the vessel and his own body. G-forces pressed him into the seat as he corkscrewed away from the station, calculating the minimum safe distance for a jump to light speed. The console lit up with warning indicators as multiple pursuit vessels launched from nearby hangars, sleek, military-grade interceptors that would catch the drifter within minutes. Mason's fingers danced across the navigation computer, inputting jump coordinates while continuously adjusting course to avoid the increasing barrage of fire. "Not today, Valerius," he muttered, punching in the final command sequence as the drifter cleared the station's immediate defense perimeter. The stars stretched into lines around him as the ship's jump drive engaged, catapulting the battered freighter into light speed and away from Atlas Command. Mason slumped back in the pilot's seat, allowing himself one moment of relief before focusing on the challenges ahead. He'd escaped, but the real journey was just beginning. The cockpit erupted with a cacophony of alarms as Mason slammed into the pilot's seat. Red warning lights flashed across every display, announcing the base-wide lockdown with irritating persistence. Outside, emergency klaxons wailed throughout the hangar as security forces regrouped. "Override safety protocols," Mason muttered, fingers dancing across the control panel. The ship's computer displayed a warning prompt, which he dismissed with an impatient swipe. "Come on, you ancient pile of bolts. Now's not the time to be cautious." The Stardust drifter's systems responded sluggishly, like an old man reluctantly rising from a comfortable chair. Indicator lights flickered uncertainly as the reactor core struggled to reach optimal temperature. Mason punched the engine ignition repeatedly, sweat beading on his forehead. "Wake up!" Through the view screen, he spotted a squad of elite guards forming a blockade at the hangar entrance. Their weapons glinted under the emergency lights, pulse rifles that could tear through the drifter's hull like paper. Behind them, Commander Valerius himself strode into view, his face a mask of cold determination as he barked orders to his men. The ship's reactor finally rumbled to life, the deck plates vibrating beneath Mason's boots. Power readings climbed from the critical red zone into cautious yellow. 70%. "Good enough," Mason growled, bypassing the pre-flight checklist entirely. He grabbed the flight controls and punched the vertical thrusters, forcing the ship to lift despite its protests. The docking clamps were still attached, metal groaning as the drifter strained against its restraints. Warning indicators blared across the console. Docking clamps engaged, unable to initiate launch. "Scrap that," Mason snapped, reaching for the emergency release lever, protected by a safety cover. He yanked it down hard, and the ship lurched as explosive bolts detonated, severing the docking clamps with brute force rather than precision disengagement. The drifter rose unevenly, listing to port as the asymmetrical release threw off its balance. Mason compensated, pushing more power to the starboard thrusters while keeping his eyes on the rapidly closing hangar doors ahead. The gap had narrowed to barely 20 meters. Tight, but still manageable for a ship of the drifter's size. Below, guards opened fire. Energy bolts peppered the underside of the ship, shields flickering weakly as they struggled to deflect the barrage. "Shield capacity at 38%, the computer announced in its maddeningly calm voice. "Recommend immediate disengagement from combat." "No kidding," Mason muttered, shoving the throttle forward. The engines responded with a reluctant wheeze before surging with power, pushing him back into his seat as the ship accelerated toward the narrowing exit. Valerius raised his hand, signaling to someone out of Mason's view. Moments later, a shower of sparks erupted from the control panel near the hangar doors as emergency override protocols were triggered. The massive doors halted momentarily before beginning to close at double speed. "Oh, you son of a black hole," Mason growled, calculations racing through his mind. At current acceleration, the drifter would reach the doors in approximately 8 seconds. The gap would be less than 5 meters by then, not enough clearance for the ship's wingspan. Mason slammed his fist onto the emergency reconfiguration control. Throughout the ship, hydraulic systems engaged as external components. Communication arrays, sensor dishes, and auxiliary thruster housings retracted into the hull. The drifter's profile narrowed by nearly 2 meters, sacrificing functionality for streamlined escape. The ship's computer protested with another series of alarms. Flight configuration compromised, navigation systems degraded, external sensors offline. "I can see with my eyes," Mason snapped, his focus entirely on the shrinking rectangle of stars beyond the doors. He adjusted the ship's angle, aiming for the exact center of the gap where the clearance would be greatest. The drifter shot forward, acceleration pressing Mason into his seat as the ship hurtled toward freedom. Guards scattered from its path, even as they continued firing. The shield indicators dropped below 20% as energy bolts found their mark. Mason held his breath as the ship reached the doors, metal screaming against metal as the drifter's hull scraped along both sides of the gap. Sparks cascaded across the view screen, and the entire ship shuddered violently. For one heart-stopping moment, Mason thought they might get wedged between the massive doors, trapped and vulnerable to the guards' weapons. Then the drifter burst through, emerging into open space with a final metallic screech. Damage reports flooded the console, but Mason ignored them, focusing instead on putting as much distance as possible between the ship and Atlas Command. Behind him, defense turrets mounted on the station's exterior swiveled to track the escaping vessel, their targeting systems locking onto the drifter's heat signature. The first volley of energy blasts lit up space around him, and Mason threw the ship into a series of evasive maneuvers that the old freighter was never designed to perform. Energy bolts arced through the air as the guards regained their positions, their weapons blazing to life in a synchronized barrage. Mason ducked instinctively as shots peppered the drifter's exterior, the impacts reverberating through the hull like metallic raindrops. The ship's shields, barely functional after the rough escape, flickered weakly with each hit. "Targeting weapons systems," shouted a voice over the facility's loudspeakers. "All units, concentrate fire on the primary engines." Mason's hands flew across the control panel, rerouting power from non-essential systems to the main thrusters. The drifter's reactor core hummed with increasing intensity, temperature gauges climbing dangerously into the red zone. "Come on, girl," Mason whispered, patting the console affectionately. "One more miracle." He thumbed the ignition sequence for the main thrusters, ancient Frontier-class propulsion units that had been salvaged from a decommissioned military vessel. They weren't pretty, and they certainly weren't regulation, but they packed enough raw power to outrun most standard pursuit craft. For 3 excruciating seconds, nothing happened. The guards' fire intensified, precision shots now targeting the vulnerable engine housings at the rear of the ship. Warning lights flashed across the console as minor systems began failing under the assault. Then the main thrusters roared to life with a thunderous explosion of blue-white energy. The Stardust Drifter lurched forward so violently that Mason was slammed back into his seat, the restraint harness cutting into his shoulders. The ship's frame groaned under the sudden acceleration, metal plates vibrating as the engines pushed far beyond recommended output levels. The hangar bay became a receding rectangle of light behind him as the drifter shot into open space, trailing wisps of superheated plasma from its exhaust ports. Inside the cockpit, Mason grinned despite the danger, feeling the familiar thrill of a successful escape flooding his system. His victory was short-lived. The proximity alarm wailed as the drifter emerged into Earth's crowded orbital lanes. A massive cargo hauler loomed directly in their path, its bloated hull filling the view screen like an approaching mountain. Mason yanked the controls hard to port, sending the drifter into a steep banking maneuver that strained both ship and pilot. The freighter skimmed past the hauler with meters to spare, close enough for Mason to glimpse startled faces through illuminated viewports. "Traffic control to unidentified vessel," crackled a voice over the emergency channel. "You are violating restricted airspace. Return to designated lanes immediately or face immediate interdiction." Mason switched off the comm system with a flick of his wrist. The last thing he needed was some traffic controller complicating his escape. He pushed the drifter deeper into the orbital chaos, using the dense web of stations, satellites, and vessels as cover against pursuit. Earth's orbital sphere was a 3-dimensional maze of established flight paths, corporate platforms, and military installations. Thousands of vessels moved in carefully choreographed patterns, maintaining precise distances and velocities. Mason's unscheduled entry into this delicate ecosystem sent ripples of disruption in all directions. Civilian craft veered from their routes as the drifter cut across designated lanes. Automated collision warnings blared throughout the network, and emergency thrusters fired as navigation systems struggled to compensate for the rogue ship tearing through their midst. Behind him, alarm sirens wailed as Atlas Command scrambled interceptors. Through the rear viewport, Mason spotted 3 sleek military vessels launching from adjacent hangars, their engines burning hot as they accelerated in pursuit. "Predictable," he muttered, pushing the drifter into a spiraling descent toward a cluster of commercial platforms. The ship responded sluggishly, damage from the hangar escape affecting its maneuverability. Mason threaded the needle between 2 massive advertising platforms, holographic displays distorting as the drifter's energy wake interfered with their projectors. The pursuing interceptors split formation, 2 following directly, while the third arced wide to cut off potential escape routes. A passenger liner crossed their path, forcing Mason to execute a stomach-churning roll that sent loose items clattering across the cockpit floor. The drifter's structural integrity warnings flashed as the aging hull protested the maneuver. Mason risked a glance at the navigation display. The interceptors were gaining, their military-grade engines easily outperforming the drifter's cobbled-together propulsion system. He needed an advantage, something to level the playing field. His eyes locked onto a maintenance tether stretching between 2 orbital platforms ahead. The massive cable, designed to transport materials and workers between stations, created a narrow gap that larger vessels avoided. "Let's see how good these pilots really are," Mason said, angling the drifter toward the gap. The ship accelerated, pushing through layers of commercial traffic toward the maintenance tether. Warning shots from the interceptors flashed past the view screen, deliberately wide. They wanted him alive, not vaporized in space. Mason tightened his harness and gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity. The gap between the tether and the nearest platform narrowed as he approached, barely wide enough for the drifter to squeeze through. Behind him, the lead interceptor realized his intention and attempted to match his course. The drifter shot through the gap with centimeters to spare, paint scraping from its hull as it brushed against the tether's protective housing. The pursuing interceptor, trying to mirror the maneuver, miscalculated its approach. Its wing clipped the tether, sending the military craft into an uncontrolled spin that forced its pilot to engage emergency stabilizers. Mason allowed himself a tight smile as the distance between him and his pursuers widened. The path ahead was clear, with Earth's atmosphere glowing like a blue jewel below and the infinite black of space above. Freedom beckoned, just a few more seconds of acceleration away. Chapter 5: Phantom Trails. The high-pitched whine of the drifter's engines filled the cockpit as Mason pushed the thrusters to their limits. The ship shuddered beneath him, protesting the abuse after the rough escape through the hangar doors. Mason checked the rear scanners, watching the orbital chaos he'd left in his wake. The disabled interceptor tumbled away from the tether, emergency thrusters firing in sporadic bursts as the pilot fought to regain control. "One down," Mason muttered, his eyes scanning the tactical display. The momentary satisfaction evaporated as 2 new contact signatures appeared on his scanner. Fresh interceptors launching from Atlas Command, their engines burning white-hot as they climbed rapidly through the orbital lanes. These weren't the standard security vessels he'd evaded earlier. The sleek, predatory profiles of Atlas Command's premier pursuit craft filled his rear viewport, their reflective hulls catching the sunlight as they accelerated toward him. Mason recognized the configuration: Raptor-class interceptors, designed specifically for pursuit and capture operations. Faster, more maneuverable, and equipped with specialized disabling weapons. "Target vessel, this is Atlas Command Interceptor Bravo 1, a stern voice crackled through his comms. "Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. This is your only warning." Mason flipped the comm switch, no point responding when his intentions were clear enough. He banked the drifter sharply, diving toward a cluster of maintenance satellites, forcing the interceptors to adjust their approach vector. The tactical display updated with the interceptor's weapon systems coming online. Not the heavy cannons capable of reducing the drifter to scrap, but the more precise disabling arrays, ion disruptors, and magnetic grapples designed to paralyze a ship without destroying it. "They want me alive," Mason muttered, cold realization settling in his gut. "That's not good." Inside the lead interceptor, Commander Valerius leaned forward in his seat, eyes locked on the fleeing vessel. He'd taken personal command of the pursuit after the hangar breach, unwilling to delegate Kane's capture to subordinates. "Target their propulsion systems," Valerius ordered through his helmet comm. "Disable, do not destroy. Command wants the pilot alive." "Sir, they're entering the commercial shipping corridor," his co-pilot responded. "Civilian traffic is heavy. Clean shots will be difficult." Valerius's jaw tightened. "Maintain pursuit. He's trying to use the civilian vessels as cover." The drifter darted between massive cargo haulers, forcing the interceptors to weave through the lumbering ships. Mason pushed his vessel to its limits, exploiting every gap in traffic, every blind spot in the orbital lanes. The lead interceptor fired a warning shot that streaked past the drifter's port side, deliberately wide but close enough to make Mason flinch. The energy discharge illuminated the cockpit with an electric blue flash. "Damn it," Mason growled, checking his navigation system. The open space beyond Earth's orbital sphere beckoned, but the interceptors were slowly closing the gap. The drifter couldn't outrun military craft in a straight chase. He needed another advantage. The second interceptor maneuvered into a flanking position, trying to box the drifter between them. Mason watched the tactical display with growing concern. They were executing a classic pincer maneuver, forcing him toward a section of space where a third vessel could intercept. An ion burst struck the drifter's rear quadrant, sending cascading electrical failures through non-essential systems. The cabin lights flickered as power rerouted to maintain engine function. "Target's shields weakening," reported the weapons officer on the lead interceptor. "One more direct hit should disable their propulsion." Valerius nodded. "Fire when ready. I want that ship dead in space." Mason felt the drifter's controls growing sluggish as damage accumulated. The interceptors were too fast, too well equipped. He needed something unpredictable, something no sane pilot would attempt. His eyes locked onto the navigational display, spotting a narrow passage between two orbital platforms. The gap was technically wide enough for the drifter to pass through, but the margins would be measured in centimeters, not meters. "Let's see how badly they want me," Mason muttered, yanking the controls and sending the drifter into a sharp turn toward the gap. The interceptors followed, maintaining their pursuit trajectory. Mason watched his distance to the platforms counting down, timing his approach perfectly. At the last possible moment, he cut the main engines and fired maneuvering thrusters in a precise sequence, sending the drifter into a controlled tumble that slipped sideways through the narrow gap. The lead interceptor pilot reacted quickly, attempting to match the maneuver, but the military vessel's greater mass and momentum worked against it. The interceptor scraped along the platform's edge, tearing a gash in its hull and sending it veering off course. The second interceptor pulled up sharply, abandoning the risky passage to arc around the platforms. The momentary reprieve gave Mason precious seconds to restore power to his engines and accelerate toward open space. On the damaged lead interceptor, Valerius slammed his fist against the console. "Don't lose him. Notify command to deploy the orbital defense grid. Kane is not leaving this system." Mason watched the interceptors regroup in his rear scanners. The lead ship wobbled slightly as it adjusted course, damage visible along its port side where it had scraped the orbital platform. Despite the collision, it remained functional. The second interceptor pulled alongside it, both vessels accelerating in perfect formation. "Persistent bastards," Mason muttered, fingers dancing across the control panel. The drifter's damage reports scrolled across his screens, none of them promising. Ion damage had compromised his shield generators, and the navigational system flickered between normal operation and emergency backup. Even at full thrust, the military interceptors would overtake him within minutes. A quick systems check confirmed what he already knew. There was no outrunning them in open space. Not with military-grade engines burning hot on his tail. The Earth filled half his viewport, the swirling blue-white sphere spinning placidly below. Mason stared at it for a long moment, then at the sensor readings showing the interceptors closing fast. A plan formed, the kind that straddled the line between brilliant and suicidal. He killed the throttle and pulled the control yoke hard, sending the drifter into a sweeping turn that aligned its nose directly toward Earth. His fingers tapped rapid commands into the navigation computer, inputting a trajectory that made the system flash warning messages across every screen. Warning: atmospheric entry angle exceeds safe parameters. Warning: heat shield integrity compromised. Warning: hull stress projections critical. Mason ignored them all. He slammed the throttle forward, sending the drifter into a steep dive straight toward Earth's atmosphere. The pursuing interceptors hesitated, their formation breaking briefly as they processed his unexpected move. In the lead interceptor, Valerius leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he watched the drifter's trajectory. "He's making a run for the atmosphere," his co-pilot reported. "At that angle, he'll burn up before reaching the stratosphere." "No, he won't," Valerius replied, his voice tight with understanding. "He's going to use atmospheric friction to bleed off speed, pull an aerobraking maneuver." "Sir, that's suicidal?" "Yes, but if anyone could pull it off." Valerius tapped the pursuit course into his console. "Follow him in. Maintain distance. Do not attempt to match his entry angle." The drifter plummeted toward Earth, acceleration pressing Mason hard against his seat. The ship began to vibrate as it hit the outer wisps of atmosphere. Temperature readings climbed rapidly as friction heated the hull. Mason kept his eyes fixed on the altimeter, waiting for the exact moment. Too shallow an angle, and the interceptors would stay on him. Too steep, and the drifter would become a shooting star. The cabin temperature rose sharply. Warning klaxons blared throughout the ship as the outer hull began to glow. Sweat beaded on Mason's forehead, whether from the heat or from concentration, he couldn't tell. "Come on, baby," he whispered to the ship. "Just hold together a little longer." The vibration intensified to a bone-rattling shudder. Through the viewports, Mason could see the hull glowing cherry red as plasma formed around the ship. The control yoke juddered in his grip, threatening to tear itself from his hands as atmospheric forces battered the vessel. Behind him, the interceptors followed a more conservative descent path, maintaining visual contact, but unwilling to match his reckless dive. Just as the heat warnings reached critical levels, Mason pulled back on the yoke and fired lateral thrusters, changing his angle of descent. The drifter skipped along the upper atmosphere like a stone across water, bleeding off tremendous speed while the outer hull absorbed punishing heat. The maneuver subjected the ship to crushing G-forces. Mason's vision tunneled as blood drained from his head. His muscles strained against the acceleration, fighting to keep his hand on the controls. One wrong move now would send the drifter tumbling into an unrecoverable spin. The interceptors attempted to adjust their course, but their more conservative entry angle put them at a disadvantage. They couldn't match the drifter's dramatic deceleration without risking their own destruction. With a final wrenching turn, Mason pulled the drifter level, skimming just above the mesosphere. The ship's velocity had dropped dramatically, but so had its structural integrity. Warning lights illuminated every system on the ship. "Damage report," Mason gasped, fighting to remain conscious as the G-forces finally relented. The computer displayed a cascade of system failures. Heat shield compromised, hull integrity at 43%, primary propulsion operating at reduced capacity. But when Mason checked his rear scanners, a grim smile spread across his face. The interceptors had fallen back, forced to take a wider, gentler path through the atmosphere. He'd bought himself precious minutes. "Looks like we'll live another day," he muttered, adjusting course toward the vast Pacific Ocean below. The drifter limped onwards, trailing a wisp of smoke from its scorched hull plating, but still flying. In the distance, the interceptors continued their pursuit, their hulls glowing as they navigated the atmosphere, slower, safer, and falling behind with every passing second. Superheated air screamed across the drifter's hull as Mason guided the ship deeper into Earth's atmosphere. Warning indicators flooded his cockpit displays, temperature gauges climbing into the red zone, structural integrity monitors flashing urgent alerts. The ship bucked beneath him like a living thing in pain. "Come on, hold together," Mason growled through clenched teeth, his knuckles white on the controls. The vibration had intensified to the point where his vision blurred, console readings swimming before his eyes. The heat shields, already compromised during his escape from Atlas Command, glowed a brilliant orange that brightened to yellow-white along the leading edges. Through the cockpit viewports, he could see the terrifying beauty of atmospheric plasma dancing across the hull, superheated particles stripping away the outer coating in glowing ribbons. Another violent shudder rocked the ship. Something critical gave way with a metallic shriek that penetrated even the howling maelstrom outside. The drifter pitched sideways, threatening to tumble into an unrecoverable spin. "Not today," Mason snarled, fighting the controls. He fired asymmetric thrusters in rapid sequence, countering the ship's wild rotation. The effort slammed him against his restraints, muscles burning with strain. In the lead interceptor, Valerius watched the drifter's reckless plunge with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "He's insane," muttered the co-pilot. "That entry angle, it's beyond survivable parameters." Valerius's eyes narrowed as he studied the trajectory calculations. "Adjust course to follow." "Sir?" The pilot's head snapped toward him in alarm. "Our interceptors aren't rated for that kind of atmospheric insertion. The heat shields won't." "I didn't say match his angle," Valerius cut in sharply. "Follow at maximum safe descent. He's gambling everything on this maneuver. Either he burns up or he gains enough distance to disappear." The pilot hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and self-preservation. "If we lose him now," Valerius added coldly, "Command will have more than just Kane to hunt." With visible reluctance, the pilot adjusted their vector, taking the interceptor into a steeper, but still relatively conservative descent path. The second interceptor followed, maintaining formation. The gap between pursuer and pursued widened as Mason committed fully to his desperate gambit. The drifter plummeted through the mesosphere, trailing a fiery wake visible from orbital stations hundreds of kilometers above. Temperature warnings escalated from urgent to critical. The ship's hull temperature approached 1,500 degrees, dangerously close to the point where even the reinforced cockpit shielding would fail. Mason's flight suit cooling system struggled against the rising cabin temperature. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking his collar. A sharp crack sent fragments of interior paneling spinning through the cockpit. Mason ducked as a piece of debris narrowly missed his head. The atmospheric density increased rapidly as the drifter continued its dive. The crushing deceleration forced Mason deep into his seat, his chest compressed to the point where each breath became a deliberate act of will. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, the prelude to unconsciousness. With the last of his strength, Mason pulled back on the control yoke, adjusting the drifter's angle to transform the deadly plunge into a more controlled descent. The ship groaned in protest, stress fractures spreading across overloaded structural members. "Just a little more," he gasped, each word a victory against the crushing G-forces. Gradually, mercifully, the violent shuddering began to subside as the drifter transitioned from uncontrolled falling to something approximating flight. The hull temperature readings, while still dangerous, stopped their precipitous climb. Mason blinked away sweat, forcing his vision to focus on the scanner display. The interceptors had followed him into the atmosphere, but had taken a much more conservative approach. They remained in pursuit but had fallen significantly behind, exactly as he'd hoped. A savage grin spread across his face despite the pain. "Told you they wouldn't follow." He checked the navigational display, taking stock of his position. The drifter had entered Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean. Below him stretched an endless expanse of blue, providing both cover and opportunity. If he could reach the water's surface, he could use the ocean's thermal signature to mask his heat trail. The ship leveled out at 30,000 meters, engines now functioning in proper atmospheric mode. The heat shield had partially ablated away, leaving the drifter wounded but still flyable. System diagnostics scrolled across the secondary display, cataloging dozens of damaged components and compromised structures. Mason ignored them all, focusing instead on his tactical options. The interceptors were still following, their superior engines gradually closing the distance he'd gained during the atmospheric insertion. They'd been cautious, but they hadn't given up. Through the clearing haze of superheated air, Mason spotted a massive bank of storm clouds developing on the horizon, a towering wall of atmospheric turbulence that stretched from ocean to stratosphere. Lightning flickered within the dark mass, illuminating the contours of the thunderheads from within. Mason adjusted course directly toward the storm front, a plan already forming in his mind. If a reckless atmospheric entry hadn't shaken his pursuers, perhaps the mother of all thunderstorms would do the trick. "Let's see how badly they want me," he muttered, pushing the wounded drifter toward the gathering tempest. The drifter rocketed toward the massive storm system, its damaged hull creaking under the strain of atmospheric flight. Through the forward viewport, Mason watched lightning fork through the towering thunderheads, a natural maelstrom that might just save his life. The interceptors had narrowed the gap to less than 10 kilometers, close enough for their targeting systems to lock onto his heat signature. "Persistent bastards," Mason muttered, checking his rear scanners. The military craft maintained perfect formation despite the turbulence, their sleek hulls cutting through the atmosphere with predatory grace. A proximity alarm shrieked, warning of an incoming projectile. Mason rolled the drifter hard to port as a concussion charge detonated where he'd been seconds before. Not designed to destroy, just to disable. They definitely wanted him alive. Mason's fingers danced across the control panel, priming the systems for what came next. The thunderstorm loomed before him, dark and violent. A wall of atmospheric chaos that stretched from ocean to stratosphere. Lightning illuminated its interior in strobing flashes, revealing the churning turbulence within. "Time for the magic trick," he whispered, reaching beneath his seat to flip a hidden switch. In the cargo hold, a panel slid open, revealing a crude device he'd assembled during quieter days. A thermal beacon wrapped in scrap metal and circuitry, designed to mimic the drifter's signature. Mason checked his trajectory one final time, making minute adjustments to his approach vector. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the pursuers would spot the deception. Too late, and the storm's interference wouldn't mask the switch. The first tendrils of the storm enveloped the drifter, buffeting the ship with violent updrafts. Visibility dropped as clouds surrounded the cockpit. Lightning flashed dangerously close, the electrical discharge playing havoc with his sensors. "Now or never," Mason said, hitting the emergency release. The decoy launched from the underside of the drifter, immediately igniting its thermal core. To any pursuing scanners, it would appear as though the drifter had suddenly accelerated deeper into the storm, the beacon's heat signature indistinguishable from engine output at this distance. The instant the decoy cleared the ship, Mason slammed his hand down on the emergency shutdown sequence. The drifter's engines died mid-flight, plunging the cockpit into darkness. Every system, every light, every power signature winked out in perfect unison. Momentum carried the now silent vessel forward, but without thrust it began to tumble in a controlled spin. Mason felt his stomach lurch as the artificial gravity fluctuated, then failed completely. He floated slightly off his seat, held in place only by his restraints as the drifter entered a ballistic trajectory. Through the viewport, Mason caught glimpses of lightning illuminating the clouds as the ship rotated. In the distance, he spotted the decoy's fiery trail slicing deeper into the heart of the storm, its trajectory mimicking a desperate escape attempt. The interceptors took the bait. Their engines flared brighter as they accelerated after the decoy, disappearing into the dense cloud bank. Mason allowed himself a tight smile as the military vessels vanished from view, chasing a phantom deeper into the tempest. The drifter continued its silent, powerless tumble through the storm's outer layer. Without engines or stabilizers, the ship was at the mercy of the violent air currents. It bucked and rolled with each new gust, threatening to tear itself apart. Inside the pitch-black cockpit, Mason gripped his restraints, counting seconds in his head. Every instinct screamed at him to restart the engines, to regain control before the ship broke apart. But that would mean revealing his position. He needed to maintain complete silence until the interceptors committed fully to chasing the decoy. A particularly violent air pocket caught the drifter, sending it into a flat spin. Warning indicators would have blared if any power ran through the systems. Instead, Mason experienced the danger in terrifying silence. Only the howl of wind against the hull and the creak of stressed metal offered any feedback. Lightning struck dangerously close, illuminating the cockpit in a blinding flash. For a split second, Mason saw the full extent of the storm's fury through the viewport, cloud formations twisting like living things, rain sheets so dense they appeared solid, and in the distance, the faint glow of the interceptors, engines still pursuing his decoy. The drifter began to drop altitude rapidly, caught in a powerful downdraft. Without power, the ship had no way to counter its fall. Mason watched the darkened altimeter, its emergency backup display showing a rapid descent toward the ocean below. "Not yet," he whispered, though no one could hear him. "Not yet." Another flash of lightning revealed the interceptors turning sharply. They'd realized the deception. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. If they reacquired him now, in this powerless state, he'd have no way to evade capture. The drifter continued its silent plummet through the storm, a ghost ship seemingly abandoned to the elements. Mason remained perfectly still, watching and waiting as gravity pulled the darkened vessel toward the churning ocean below, gambling everything on this moment of absolute vulnerability. The decoy plunged through the heart of the storm, its thermal core burning white-hot as it spiraled toward the ocean. Rain vaporized instantly against its superheated surface, creating a distinctive steam trail visible even through the dense cloud cover. To any watching sensors, the signature precisely matched a critically damaged ship in terminal descent, a vessel breaking apart during catastrophic re-entry. Inside the lead interceptor, Valerius leaned forward as his tactical display tracked the plummeting heat signature. The readings spiked dramatically, then fluctuated in the pattern characteristic of a ship losing structural integrity. "Target appears to be breaking up," reported his sensor officer, voice tight with professional satisfaction. "Hull temperature exceeding sustainable limits." Valerius's eyes narrowed, studying the data feed. Something felt wrong. Kane was reckless, but he'd proven himself skilled enough to survive maneuvers that should have killed him. This sudden failure seemed convenient. "Maintain pursuit," he ordered. "I want visual confirmation." The interceptors pushed deeper into the storm, fighting brutal crosswinds and microbursts that threatened to throw them off course. Lightning danced around their hulls, the electrical discharges interfering with their sensors. Visibility reduced to near zero as sheets of rain hammered their viewports. "Sir, we're approaching dangerous conditions," the pilot warned. "These interceptors aren't designed for severe weather penetration." On the tactical display, the heat signature suddenly flared brilliantly, then fragmented into multiple smaller readings. The pattern matched precisely with catastrophic power core failure, the moment when a ship's engines exploded, tearing the vessel apart. "Target has disintegrated," the sensor officer announced, registering multiple debris signatures consistent with total structural failure. In the cockpit of the second interceptor, the pilot let out a low whistle. "Looks like the crazy bastard finally pushed it too far." Valerius remained silent, still unconvinced. He manipulated the sensor controls himself, trying to isolate any anomalies in the readings. The storm's interference made detailed analysis impossible. All they could see clearly was the bright thermal bloom of what appeared to be a destroyed spacecraft. "Sir," his co-pilot said quietly, "we need to pull up. Hull integrity is approaching critical from repeated lightning strikes." Valerius hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Record all sensor data for analysis. Bravo 2, deploy a tracker drone to monitor the debris field." The second interceptor released a small autonomous drone that disappeared into the clouds, programmed to search the presumed crash site. Both military vessels banked sharply, climbing away from the storm toward clearer air. "Command, this is Pursuit Leader," Valerius transmitted. "Target appears destroyed during atmospheric re-entry. Confirmation pending drone analysis." Miles away, the powerless drifter continued its silent descent through the storm's outer bands. Mason allowed himself to exhale slowly as the interceptor's engine signatures faded from his emergency backup sensors. The ruse had worked, at least temporarily. He waited until the military vessels had climbed well above the storm before initiating a minimal power restart. The drifter's systems came back online one by one, prioritizing flight control and stabilizers. The engines remained cold. Their thermal signature would be too easily detected if the interceptors remained in scanning range. Mason engaged the emergency glide system, extending aerodynamic control surfaces that transformed the drifter from a tumbling object into something resembling a glider. With careful manipulation of the atmospheric control flaps, he arrested the ship's dangerous spin and established a controlled descent path. Through breaks in the cloud cover, he could see the ocean's surface approaching, dark and turbulent, white caps visible even from this altitude. The drifter would need power to manage a water landing, but Mason held off, watching his sensors for any sign the interceptors had doubled back. "They bought it," he murmured, checking the tactical display one final time. The interceptors had established a holding pattern high above the storm, likely waiting for their drone to confirm his supposed destruction. Mason allowed himself a tight smile. The thermal decoy had performed perfectly, mimicking not just his engine signature, but also the distinctive pattern of a ship breaking apart during atmospheric failure. The scattered debris would further sell the illusion. Small fragments of metal and components he'd loaded into the decoy specifically for this purpose. As far as Atlas Command was concerned, Mason Kane had just died in a fiery crash. It was exactly the outcome he needed. With the interceptors believing their target destroyed, Mason finally engaged minimal power to the drifter's engines, just enough to control his descent toward the churning ocean below. The ship responded sluggishly, its systems damaged from the brutal atmospheric entry, but it remained flyable. "Let's find somewhere quiet to lick our wounds," he said to the ship, patting the scarred control panel. The drifter had survived worse, they both had. Through the viewports, Mason could see the storm beginning to thin as he approached the ocean. Beyond the weather system stretched the vast Pacific, offering countless places to hide while he repaired his ship and planned his next move. Atlas Command would eventually realize they'd been deceived, but by then, he'd be long gone. For now, Mason Kane was officially dead, and that made him more dangerous than ever. The damaged drifter drifted silently through the turbulent air currents, riding the storm's outer edge like a leaf on water. Mason kept all non-essential systems powered down, the cockpit illuminated only by the storm's intermittent lightning and the dim glow of his emergency displays. Through the viewport, he tracked the interceptor's position as they circled high above the storm, waiting for confirmation of his destruction. "Come on," Mason whispered, fingers tapping impatiently against the control yoke. "Take the bait and go home." As if in answer, the tactical display showed the interceptors breaking their holding pattern. Their engines flared brightly as they began moving away from the storm system, climbing toward the upper atmosphere. Mason held his breath, watching intently as the military vessels accelerated into a trajectory that would return them to orbit. "They're buying it," he muttered, a grim smile spreading across his face. The deception had worked, at least for now. The interceptors believed they were pursuing the wreckage of a destroyed ship, not a pilot who'd pulled off the oldest trick in the book. Mason waited another 20 minutes, drifting through the storm's diminishing clouds on minimal power. The ocean spread out below him, a vast expanse of darkness punctuated by whitecaps. Only when the interceptors had completely disappeared from his long-range sensors did he dare to fully power up the drifter systems again. The ship came alive around him, displays illuminating with damage reports and system diagnostics. The hull had suffered significant heat damage during the atmospheric insertion, and several minor systems remained offline. But the core components, engines, navigation, life support, remained functional. The drifter was wounded but still capable of flight. "Time to disappear properly," Mason said, hands dancing across the controls as he plotted a new course. He brought the ship to a hover just above the ocean's surface, using the water's thermal mass to mask his heat signature. Waves crashed just meters below the drifter's belly, as Mason carefully aligned his trajectory with the planet's rotation. This was the tricky part. He needed to return to space without using the kind of high-energy burn that would light up every sensor in Earth orbit. That meant a slow, gradual ascent using the planet's rotation to assist his climb. A technique that required precision flying and patience, neither of which came naturally to him. "Low and slow," he reminded himself, easing the throttle forward with delicate pressure. The drifter lifted away from the ocean's surface, climbing at a shallow angle that would appear unremarkable to orbital sensors. Just another atmospheric transport making a routine ascent. Mason kept his velocity deliberately modest, following shipping lanes and commercial flight paths to blend with normal traffic. As the ship climbed through the upper atmosphere, Mason activated the adaptive hull coating, a smuggler's modification he'd installed during quieter days. The specialized material absorbed and dissipated thermal emissions, making the drifter appear cooler than its actual temperature. It wouldn't fool military-grade scanners at close range, but it would help him avoid casual detection from a distance. The sky gradually darkened from blue to indigo to black as the drifter left Earth's atmosphere behind. Stars emerged, cold and distant, as Mason guided his ship into low orbit. He maintained radio silence, passive sensors only, minimizing his electromagnetic footprint as he merged with the orbital debris field that surrounded Earth like a shroud. Decades of careless space exploitation had left Earth encircled by a cloud of defunct satellites, spent rocket stages, and fragments from long-forgotten missions. Most ships avoided these dangerous zones, but for someone looking to disappear, the debris field offered perfect cover. Mason guided the drifter into the thickest section of the debris cloud, adjusting his velocity to match the orbital drift of the surrounding objects. To any watching sensors, the ship would appear as just another piece of space junk, unremarkable and not worth tracking. "Hide in plain sight," Mason murmured, powering down all non-essential systems once more. The drifter went dark, drifting among the silent ruins of humanity's earlier space ambitions. Through the viewport, Earth rotated slowly below, a blue-white jewel against the blackness of space. Mason studied the familiar continents with mixed emotions. He'd just burned his last bridge with his homeworld. Whatever his next move, returning to Earth would be suicide. He pulled up the long-range navigational display, considering his options. Atlas Command controlled most of the major jump points in the solar system. Their interceptors would be waiting at the established routes, expecting him to make a break for deep space. Going that way would mean certain capture. But Mason knew other paths, smugglers' routes, and hidden jump points, documented only in the memories of pilots who operated on the fringes of legitimate space travel. He plotted a course toward one such exit point, a gravitational anomaly in the outer system that could be exploited by a skilled pilot with more courage than sense. The route would take him dangerously close to Jupiter's radiation belts, but it offered something no official jump point could: a clean escape, unmonitored by Atlas Command's watchful eyes. Mason initiated a minimal power burn, so gentle it barely registered on the drifter's own instruments. The ship began to move away from Earth's orbit, accelerating with glacial patience toward the outer system. It would take days rather than hours at this speed, but Mason had survived this long by knowing when to run flat out, and when to move so slowly that no one noticed him at all. "Goodbye, Earth," he said quietly, watching his homeworld recede behind him. "Don't wait up."